He must marry someone, that was already settled. He could not marry a lady, that was absurd. He must marry a poor woman. Yes, but a fallen one, was he not fallen himself? Ellen would fall no more. He had only to look at her to be sure of this. He could not live with her in sin, not for more than the shortest time that could elapse before their marriage. He no longer believed in the supernatural element of Christianity, but the Christian morality at any rate was indisputable. Besides, they might have children, and a stigma would rest upon them. Whom had he to consult but himself now? His father and mother never need know, and even if they did, they should be thankful to see him married to any woman who would make him happy as Ellen would. As for not being able to afford marriage, how did poor people do? Did not a good wife rather help matters than not? Where one could live two could do so, and if Ellen was 3 or 4 years older than he was, well, what was that? Have you, gentle reader, ever loved at first sight? When you fell in love at first sight, how long, let me ask, did it take you to become ready to fling every other consideration to the winds, except that of obtaining possession of the loved one? Or rather, how long would it have taken you if you had had no father or mother, nothing to lose in the way of money, position, friends, professional advancement, or what not, and if the object of your affections was as free from all these impedimenta as you were yourself? If you were a young John Stuart Mill, perhaps it would have taken you some time, but suppose your nature was quixotic, impulsive, altruistic, guileless. Suppose you were a hungry man starving for something to love and lean upon, for one whose burdens you might bear, and who might help you to bear yours. Suppose you were down on your luck, still stunned by a horrible shock, and this bright vista of a happy future floated suddenly before you. How long under these circumstances do you think you would reflect before you would decide on embracing what chance had thrown in your way? It did not take my hero long, for before he got past the ham and beef shop near the top of Fetter Lane, he had told Ellen that she must come home with him and live with him till they could get married, which they would do upon the first day that the law allowed. I think the devil must have chuckled and made tolerably sure of his game this time. Chapter 72. Ernest told Ellen of his difficulty about finding employment. "But what do you think of going into a shop for, my dear?" said Ellen. "Why not take a little shop yourself?" Ernest asked how much this would cost. Ellen told him that he might take a house in some small street, say near the Elephant and Castle, for 17s or 18s a week, and let off the 2 top floors for 10s, keeping the back parlour and shop for themselves. If he could raise £5 or £6 to buy some second-hand clothes to stock the shop with, they could mend them and clean them, and she could look after the women's clothes while he did the men's. Then he could mend and make if he could get the orders. They could soon make a business of 2 a week in this way. She had a friend who began like that, and had now moved to a better shop, where she made 5 or 6 a week at least, and she, Ellen, had done the greater part of the buying and selling herself. Here was a new light indeed. It was as though he had got his 5,000 back again all of a sudden, and perhaps ever so much more later on into the bargain. Ellen seemed more than ever to be his good genius. She went out and got a few rashers of bacon for his and her breakfast. She cooked them much more nicely than he had been able to do, and laid breakfast for him and made coffee, and some nice brown toast. Ernest had been his own cook and housemaid for the last few days, and had not given himself satisfaction. Here he suddenly found himself with someone to wait on him again. Not only had Ellen pointed out to him how he could earn a living when no one except himself had known how to advise him, but here she was so pretty and smiling, looking after even his comforts, and restoring him practically in all respects that he much cared about to the position which he had lost her, rather putting him in one that he already liked much better. No wonder he was radiant when he came to explain his plans to me. He had some difficulty in telling all that had happened. He hesitated, blushed, hummed and hawed. Misgivings began to cross his mind when he found himself obliged to tell his story to someone else. He felt inclined to slur things over, but I wanted to get at the facts, so I helped him over the bad places, and questioned him till I had got out pretty nearly the whole story as I have given it above. I hope I did not show it, but I was very angry. I had begun to like Ernest. I don't know why, but I never have heard that any young man to whom I had become attached was going to get married without hating his intended instinctively, though I had never seen her. I have observed that most bachelors feel the same thing, though we are generally at some pains to hide the fact. Perhaps it is because we know we ought to have got married ourselves. Ordinarily, we say we are delighted. In the present case I did not feel obliged to do this, though I made an effort to conceal my vexation. That a young man of much promise, who was heir also to what was now a handsome fortune, should fling himself away upon such a person as Ellen was quite too provoking, and the more so because of the unexpectedness of the whole affair. I begged him not to marry Ellen, yet not at least until he had known her for a longer time. He would not hear of it. He had given his word, and if he had not given it, he should go and give it at once. I had hitherto found him upon most matters singularly docile and easy to manage, but on this point I could do nothing with him. His recent victory over his father and mother had increased his strength, and I was nowhere. I would have told him of his true position, but I knew very well that this would only make him more bent on having his own wafer. With so much money, why should he not please himself? I said nothing, therefore, on this head, and yet all that I could urge went for very little with one who believed himself to be an artisan or nothing. Really, from his own standpoint, there was nothing very outrageous in what he was doing. He had known and been very fond of Ellen years before. He knew her to come of respectable people, and to have borne a good character, and to have been universally liked at Battersby. She was then a quick, smart, hard-working girl, and a very pretty one. When at last they met again, she was on her best behaviour. In fact, she was modesty and demureness itself. What wonder, then, that his imagination should fail to realise the changes that 8 years must have worked? He knew too much against himself, and was too bankrupt in love to be squeamish. If Ellen had been only what he thought her, and if his prospects had been in reality no better than he believed they were, I do not know that there is anything much more imprudent in what Ernest proposed than there is in half the marriages that take place every day. There was nothing for it, however, but to make the best of the inevitable, so I wished my young friend good fortune, and told him he could have whatever money he wanted to start his shop with, if what he had in hand was not sufficient. He thanked me, asked me to be kind enough to let him do all my mending and repairing, and to get him any other like orders that I could, and left me to my own reflections. I was even more angry when he was gone than I had been while he was with me. His frank, boyish face had beamed with a happiness that had rarely visited it. Except at Cambridge, he had hardly known what happiness meant, and even there his life had been clouded as of a man for whom wisdom at the greatest of its entrances was quite shut out. I had seen enough of the world and of him to have observed this, but it was impossible, or I thought it had been impossible, for me to have helped him. Whether I ought to have tried to help him or not I do not know, but I am sure that the young of all animals often do want help upon matters about which anyone would say a priori that there should be no difficulty. One would think that a young seal would want no teaching how to swim, nor yet a bird to fly, but in practice, a young seal drowns if put out of its depth before its parents have taught it to swim, and so again, even the young hawk must be taught to fly before it can do so. I grant that the tendency of the times is to exaggerate the good which teaching can do, but in trying to teach too much in most matters, we have neglected others in respect of which a little sensible teaching would do no harm. I know it is the fashion to say that young people must find out things for themselves, and so they probably would if they had fair play to the extent of not having obstacles put in their way. But they seldom have fair play. As a general rule, they meet with foul play, and foul play from those who live by selling them stones made into a great variety of shapes and sizes, so as to form a tolerable imitation of bread. Some are lucky enough to meet with few obstacles, some are plucky enough to override them, but in the greater number of cases, if people are saved at all, they are saved so as by fire. While Ernest was with me, Ellen was looking out for a shop on the south side of the Thames near the Elephant and Castle, which was then almost a new and a very rising neighbourhood. By one art clerk she had found several from which a selection was to be made, and before night the pair had made their choice. Ernest brought Ellen to me. I did not want to see her, but could not well refuse. He had laid out a few of his shillings upon her wardrobe, so that she was neatly dressed, and indeed she looked very pretty and so good that I could hardly be surprised at Ernest's infatuation when the other circumstances of the case were taken into consideration. Of course we hated one another instinctively from the first moment we set eyes on one another, but we each told Ernest that we had been most favourably impressed. Then I was taken to see the shop. An empty house is like a stray dog or a body from which life has departed. Decay sets in at once in every part of it, and what mould and wind and weather would spare, street boys commonly destroy. Ernest's shop in its untenanted state was a dirty, unsavoury place enough. The house was not old, but it had been run up by a jerry-builder, and its constitution had no stamina whatever. It was only by being kept warm and quiet that it would remain in health for many months together. Now it had been empty for some weeks, and the cats had got in by night, while the boys had broken the windows by day. The parlour floor was covered with stones and dirt, and in the area was a dead dog which had been killed in the street and been thrown down into the first unprotected place that could be found. There was a strong smell throughout the house, but whether it was bugs or rats or cats or drains or a compound of all four I could not determine. The sashes did not fit, the flimsy doors hung badly, the skirting was gone in several places, and there were not a few holes in the floor, the locks were loose and paper was torn and dirty, the stairs were weak and one felt the treads give as one went up them. Over and above these drawbacks the house had an ill name, by reason of the fact that the wife of the last occupant had hanged herself in it not very many weeks previously. She had set down a bloater before the fire for her husband's tea, and had made him a round of toast. She then left the room as though about to return to it shortly, but instead of doing so, she went into the back kitchen and hanged herself without a word. It was this which had kept the house empty so long, in spite of its excellent position as a corner shop. The last tenant had left immediately after the inquest, and if the owner had had it done up then, people would have got over the tragedy that had been enacted in it. But the combination of bad condition and bad fame had hindered many from taking it, who, like Ellen, could see that it had great business capabilities. Almost anything would have sold there, but it happened also that there was no second-hand clothes shop in close proximity, so that everything combined in its favour, except its filthy state and its reputation. When I saw it, I thought I would rather die than live in such an awful placebut. Then I had been living in the Temple for the last 25 years. Ernest was lodging in Laystall Street, and had just come out of prison. Before this he had lived in Ashpit Place, so that this house had no terrors for him, provided he could get it done up. The difficulty was that the landlord was hard to move in this respect. It ended in my finding the money to do everything that was wanted, and taking a lease of the house for 5 years at the same rental as that paid by the last occupant. I then sublet it to Ernest, of course taking care that it was put more efficiently into repair than his landlord was at all likely to have put it. A week later I called and found everything so completely transformed that I should hardly have recognized the house. All the ceilings had been whitewashed, all the rooms papered, the broken glass hacked out and reinstated, the defective woodwork renewed, all the sashes, cupboards and doors had been painted. The drains had been thoroughly overhauled, everything in fact that could be done had been done, and the rooms now looked as cheerful as they had been forbidding when I had last seen them. The people who had done the repairs were supposed to have cleaned the house down before leaving, but Ellen had given it another scrub from top to bottom herself after they were gone, and it was as clean as a new pin. I almost felt as though I could have lived in it myself, and as for Ernest, he was in the 7th heaven. He said it was all my doing and Ellen's. There was already a counter in the shop and a few fittings, so that nothing now remained but to get some stock and set them out for sale. Ernest said he could not begin better than by selling his clerical wardrobe and his books, for though the shop was intended especially for the sale of second-hand clothes, yet Ellen said there was no reason why they should not sell a few books too, so a beginning was to be made by selling the books he had had at school and college at about 1 shilling a volume, taking them all round, and I have heard him say that he learned more that proved of practical use to him through stocking his books on a bench in front of his shop and selling them, than he had done from all the years of study which he had bestowed upon their contents. For the enquiries that were made of him whether he had such and such a book taught him what he could sell and what he could not, how much he could get for this and how much for that. Having made ever such a little beginning with books, he took to attending book sales as well as clothes sales, and ere long this branch of his business became no less important than the tailoring, and would, I have no doubt, have been the one which he would have settled down to exclusively if he had been called upon to remain a tradesman. But this is anticipating. I made a contribution and a stipulation. Ernest wanted to sink the gentleman completely, until such time as he could work his way up again. If he had been left to himself, he would have lived with Ellen in the shop back parlour and kitchen, and have let out both the upper floors according to his original programme. I did not want him, however, to cut himself adrift from music, letters and polite life, and feared that unless he had some kind of den into which he could retire he would ere long become the tradesman and nothing else. I therefore insisted on taking the first floor front and back myself, and furnishing them with the things which had been left at Mrs. Jupp's. I bought these things of him for a small sum, and had them moved into his present abode. I went to Mrs. Jupp's to arrange all this, as Ernest did not like going to Ashpit Place. I had half expected to find the furniture sold and Mrs. Jupp gone, but it was not so. With all her faults, the poor old woman was perfectly honest. I told her that Prior had taken all Ernest's money and run away with it. She hated Prior. I never knew anyone, she exclaimed, as white-livered in the face as that Prior. He hasn't got an upright vein in his whole body. Why, all that time when he used to come breakfasting with Mr. Pontifex morning after morning, it took me to a perfect shadow the way he carried on. There was no doing anything to please him right. First I used to get them eggs and bacon, and he didn't like that. And then I got him a bit of fish, and he didn't like that, or else it was too dear, and you know fish is dearer than ever. And then I got him a bit of German, and he said it rose on him. Then I tried sausages, and he said they hit him in the eye worse even than German. Oh, how I used to wander my room and fret about it inwardly and cry for hours, and all about them poultry breakfasts, and it wasn't Mr. Pontifex. He'd like anything that anyone chose to give him. And so the piano's to go, she continued. What beautiful tunes Mr. Pontifex did play upon it, to be sure, and there was one I liked better than any I ever heard. I was in the room when he played it once, and when I said, "Oh, Mr. Pontifex, that's the kind of woman I am," he said, "No, Mrs. Jupp, it isn't, for this tune is old, but no one can say you are old." But bless you, he meant nothing by it, it was only his mucky flattery. Like myself, she was vexed at his getting married. She didn't like his being married, and she didn't like his not being married, but, anyhow, it was Ellen's fault, not his, and she hoped he would be happy. But after all, she concluded, it ain't you and it ain't me, and it ain't him and it ain't her. It's what you must call the fortunes of matrimony, for there ain't no other word for it. In the course of the afternoon the furniture arrived at Ernest's new abode. In the first floor we placed the piano, table, pictures, bookshelves, a couple of armchairs, and all the little household gods which he had brought from Cambridge. The back room was furnished exactly as his bedroom at Ashpit Place had been, new things being got for the bridal apartment downstairs. These 2 first-floor rooms I insisted on retaining as my own, but Ernest was to use them whenever he pleased. He was never to sublet even the bedroom, but was to keep it for himself in case his wife should be ill at any time, or in case he might be ill himself. In less than a fortnight from the time of his leaving prison, all these arrangements had been completed, and Ernest felt that he had again linked himself on to the life which he had led before his imprisonment, with a few important differences, however, which were greatly to his advantage. He was no longer a clergyman. He was about to marry a woman to whom he was much attached, and he had parted company for ever with his father and mother. True, he had lost all his money, his reputation, and his position as a gentleman. He had, in fact, had to burn his house down in order to get his roast-sucking pig. But if asked whether he would rather be as he was now or as he was on the day before his arrest, he would not have had a moment's hesitation in preferring his present to his past. If his present could only have been purchased at the expense of all that he had gone through, it was still worth purchasing at the price, and he would go through it all again if necessary. The loss of the money was the worst, but Ellen said she was sure they would get on, and she knew all about it. As for the loss of reputation, considering that he had Ellen and me left, it did not come to much. I saw the house on the afternoon of the day on which all was finished, and there remained nothing but to buy some stock and begin selling. When I was gone, after he had had his tea, he stole up to his castle, the first-floor front. He lit his pipe and sat down to the piano. He played Handel for an hour or so, and then set himself to the table to read and write. He took all his sermons and all the theological works he had begun to compose during the time he had been a clergyman, and put them in the fire. As he saw them consume, he felt as though he had got rid of another incubus. Then he took up some of the little pieces he had begun to write during the latter part of his undergraduate life at Cambridge, and began to cut them about and rewrite them. As he worked quietly at these till he heard the clock strike 10, and it was time to go to bed, he felt that he was now not only happy but supremely happy. Next day Ellen took him to Debenham's auction rooms, and they surveyed the lots of clothes which were hung up all round the auction room to be viewed. Ellen had had sufficient experience to know about how much each lot ought to fetch. She overhauled lot after lot, and valued it. In a very short time Ernest himself began to have a pretty fair idea what each lot should go for, and before the morning was overvalued a dozen lots, running at prices about which Ellen said he would not hurt if he could get them for that. So far from disliking this work or finding it tedious, he liked it very much, Indeed, he would have liked anything which did not overtax his physical strength, and which held out a prospect of bringing him in money. Ellen would not let him buy anything on the occasion of this sale. She said he had better see one sale first, and watch how prices actually went. So at 12 o'clock, when the sale began, he saw the lots sold which he and Ellen had marked, and by the time the sale was over he knew enough to be able to bid with safety whenever he should actually want to buy. Knowledge of this sort is very easily acquired by anyone who is in bona fide want of it. But Ellen did not want him to buy at auctions, not much, at least at present. Private dealing, she said, was best. If I, for example, had any cast-off clothes, he was to buy them from my laundress and get a connection with other laundresses, to whom he might give a trifle more than they got at present for whatever clothes their masters might give them, and yet make a good profit. If gentlemen sold their things, he was to try and get them to sell to him. He flinched at nothing. Perhaps he would have flinched if he had had any idea how outre his proceedings were, but the very ignorance of the world which had ruined him up till now, by a happy irony, began to work its own cure. If some malignant fairy had meant to curse him in this respect, she had overdone her malice. He did not know he was doing anything strange. He only knew that he had no money and must provide for himself, a wife, and a possible family. More than this, he wanted to have some leisure in an evening, so that he might read and write and keep up his music. If anyone would show him how he could do better than he was doing, he should be much obliged to them, but to himself it seemed that he was doing sufficiently well, for at the end of the first week the pair found they had made a clear profit of 3. In a few weeks this had increased to 4, and by the new year they had made a profit of 5 in 1 week. Ernest had by this time been married some 2 months, for he had stuck to his original plan of marrying Ellen on the first day he could legally do so. This date was a little delayed by the change of abode from Laystall Street to Blackfriars, but on the first day that it could be done it was done. He had never had more than 250 a year, even in the times of his affluence, so that a profit of 5 a week, if it could be maintained steadily, would place him where he had been as far as income went, and though he should have to feed 2 mouths instead of 1, yet his expenses in other ways were so much curtailed by his changed social position that, take it all round, his income was practically what it had been a 12-month before. The next thing to do was to increase it, and put by money. Prosperity depends, as we all know, in great measure upon energy and good sense, but it also depends not a little upon pure luck, that is to say, upon connections which are in such a tangle that it is more easy to say that they do not exist than to try to trace them. A neighbourhood may have an excellent reputation as being likely to be a rising one, and yet may become suddenly eclipsed by another, which no one would have thought so promising. A fever hospital may divert the stream of business, or a new station attract it. So little indeed can be certainly known, that it is better not to try to know more than is in everybody's mouth, and to leave the rest to chance. Luck, which certainly had not been too kind to my hero hitherto, now seemed to have taken him under her protection. The neighbourhood prospered, and he with it. It seemed as though he no sooner bought a thing and put it into his shop, than it sold with a profit of from 30 to 50%. He learned bookkeeping, and watched his accounts carefully, following up any success immediately. He began to buy other things besides clothes, such as books, music, odds and ends of furniture, etc. Whether it was luck or business aptitude, or energy, or the politeness with which he treated all his customers, I cannot say, but to the surprise of no one more than himself, he went ahead faster than he had anticipated, even in his wildest dreams, and by Easter was established in a strong position as the owner of a business which was bringing him in between 400 and 500 a year, and which he understood how to extend. Chapter 73. Ellen and he got on capitally, all the better perhaps because the disparity between them was so great that neither did Ellen want to be elevated, nor did Ernest want to elevate her. He was very fond of her and very kind to her. They had interests which they could serve in common. They had antecedents with a good part of which each was familiar. They had each of them excellent tempers, and this was enough. Ellen did not seem jealous at Ernest's preferring to sit the greater part of his time, after the day's work was done, in the first floor front, where I occasionally visited him. She might have come and sat with him if she had liked, but somehow or other she generally found enough to occupy her down below. She had the tact also to encourage him to go out of an evening whenever he had a mind, without in the least caring that he should take her too, and this suited Ernest very well. He was, I should say, much happier in his married life than people generally are. At first it had been very painful to him to meet any of his old friends, as he sometimes accidentally did, but this soon passed. Either they cut him or he cut them. It was not nice being cut for the first time or two, but after that it became rather pleasant than not, and when he began to see that he was going ahead, he cared very little what people might say about his antecedents. The ordeal is a painful one, but if a man's moral and intellectual constitution are naturally sound, there is nothing which will give him so much strength of character as having been well cut. It was easy for him to keep his expenditure down, for his tastes were not luxurious. He liked theatres, outings into the country on a Sunday, and tobacco, but he did not care for much else except writing and music. As for the usual run of concerts, he hated them. He worshipped Handel, he liked Offenbach and the airs that went about the streets, but he cared for nothing between these two extremes. Music, therefore, cost him little. As for theatres, I got him and Ellen as many orders as they liked, so these cost them nothing. The Sunday outings were a small item. For a shilling or two he could get a return ticket to some place far enough out of town to give him a good walk and a thorough change for the day. Ellen went with him the first few times, but she said she found it too much for her. There were a few of her old friends whom she should sometimes like to see, and they and he, she said, would not hit it off perhaps too well, so it would be better for him to go alone. This seemed so sensible, and suited Ernest so exactly that he readily fell into it, nor did he suspect dangers which were apparent enough to me when I heard how she had treated the matter. I kept silence, however, and for a time all continued to go well. As I have said, one of his chief pleasures was in writing. If a man carries with him a little sketch book and is continually jotting down sketches, he has the artistic instinct. 100 things may hinder his due development, but the instinct is there. The literary instinct may be known by a man's keeping a small notebook in his waistcoat pocket, into which he jots down anything that strikes him, or any good thing that he hears said, or a reference to any passage which he thinks will come in useful to him. Ernest had such a notebook always with him. Even when he was at Cambridge he had begun the practice without anyone's having suggested it to him. These notes he copied out from time to time into a book, which as they accumulated, he was driven into indexing approximately as he went along. When I found out this, I knew that he had the literary instinct, and when I saw his notes I began to hope great things of him. For a long time I was disappointed. He was kept back by the nature of the subjects he chose, which were generally metaphysical. In vain, I tried to get him away from these to matters which had a greater interest for the general public. When I begged him to try his hand at some pretty, graceful little story which should be full of whatever people knew and liked best, he would immediately set to work upon a treatise to show the grounds on which all belief rested. "You are stirring mud," said I, "or poking at a sleeping dog. You are trying to make people resume consciousness about things which with sensible men have already passed into the unconscious stage. The men whom you would disturb are in front of you, and not, as you fancy, behind you. It is you who are the lagger, not they." He could not see it. He said he was engaged on an essay upon the famous quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus of St. Vincent de Lerins. This was the more provoking because he showed himself able to do better things if he had liked. I was then at work upon my burlesque, The Impatient Griselda, and was sometimes at my wit's end for a piece of business or a situation. He gave me many suggestions, all of which were marked by excellent good sense. Nevertheless, I could not prevail with him to put philosophy on one side, and was obliged to leave him to himself. For a long time, as I have said, his choice of subjects continued to be such as I could not approve. He was continually studying scientific and metaphysical writers, in the hope of either finding or making for himself a philosopher's stone in the shape of a system which should go on all fours under all circumstances, instead of being liable to be upset at every touch and turn, as every system yet promulgated has turned out to be. He kept to the pursuit of this Willithuisp so long that I gave up hope, and set him down as another fly that had been caught, as it were, by a piece of paper daubed over with some sticky stuff that had not even the merit of being sweet. But to my surprise, he at last declared that he was satisfied, and had found what he wanted. I supposed that he had only hit upon some new low here, when to my relief he told me that he had concluded that no system which should go perfectly upon all fours was possible, inasmuch as no one could get behind Bishop Berkeley, and therefore no absolutely incontrovertible first premise could ever be laid. Having found this, he was just as well pleased as if he had found the most perfect system imaginable. All he wanted, he said, was to know which way it was to bet, that is to say whether a system was possible or not, and if possible then what the system was to be. Having found out that no system based on absolute certainty was possible, he was contented. I had only a very vague idea who Bishop Berkeley was, but was thankful to him for having defended us from an incontrovertible first premise. I am afraid I said a few words implying that after a great deal of trouble he had arrived at the conclusion which sensible people reach without bothering their brains so much. He said, "Yes, but I was not born sensible. A child of ordinary powers learns to walk at a year or two old without knowing much about it. Failing ordinary powers, he had better learn laboriously than never learn at all. I am sorry I was not stronger, but to do as I did was my only chance." He looked so meek that I was vexed with myself for having said what I had, more especially when I remembered his bringing up, which had doubtless done much to impair his power of taking a common-sense view of things. He continued, "I see it all now. The people like Towneley are the only ones who know anything that is worth knowing, and like that of course I can never be. But to make Towneleys possible, there must be hewers of wood and drawers of watermen, in fact, through whom conscious knowledge must pass before it can reach those who can apply it gracefully and instinctively as the Towneleys can. I am a hewer of wood, but if I accept the position frankly and do not set up to be a Towneley, it does not matter." He still, therefore, stuck to science instead of turning to literature proper, as I hoped he would have done, but he confined himself henceforth to enquiries on specific subjects, concerning which an increase of our knowledges, he said, was possible. Having, in fact, after infinite vexation of spirit, arrived at a conclusion which cut at the roots of all knowledge, he settled contentedly down to the pursuit of knowledge, and has pursued it ever since in spite of occasional excursions into the regions of literature proper. But this is anticipating, and may perhaps also convey a wrong impression, for from the outset he did occasionally turn his attention to work which must be more properly called literary than either scientific or metaphysical. Chapter 74. About 6 months after he had set up his shop, his prosperity had reached its climax. It seemed even then as though he were likely to go ahead no less fast than heretofore, and I doubt not that he would have done so, if success or non-success had depended upon himself alone. Unfortunately, he was not the only person to be reckoned with. One morning he had gone out to attend some sales, leaving his wife perfectly well, as usual in good spirits and looking very pretty. When he came back he found her sitting on a chair in the back parlour, with her hair over her face, sobbing and crying as though her heart would break. She said she had been frightened in the morning by a man who had pretended to be a customer, and had threatened her unless she gave him some things, and she had had to give them to him in order to save herself from violence. She had been in hysterics ever since the man had gone. This was her story, but her speech was so incoherent that it was not easy to make out what she said. Ernest knew she was with child, and thinking this might have something to do with the matter, would have sent for a doctor if Ellen had not begged him not to do so. Anyone who had had experience of drunken people would have seen at a glance what the matter was, but my hero knew nothing about them, nothing, that is to say, about the drunkenness of the habitual drunkard, which shows itself very differently from that of one who gets drunk only once in a way. The idea that his wife could drink had never even crossed his mind. Indeed, she always made a fuss about taking more than a very little beer, and never touched spirits. He did not know much more about hysterics than he did about drunkenness, but he had always heard that women who were about to become mothers were liable to be easily upset, and were often rather flighty, so he was not greatly surprised, and thought he had settled the matter by registering the discovery that being about to become a father has its troublesome as well as its pleasant side. The great change in Ellen's life consequent upon her meeting Ernest and getting married had for a time actually sobered her by shaking her out of her old ways. Drunkenness is so much a matter of habit, and habit so much a matter of surroundings, that if you completely change the surroundings you will sometimes get rid of the drunkenness altogether. Ellen had intended remaining always sober henceforward, and never having had so long a steady fit before, believed she was now cured. So she perhaps would have been if she had seen none of her old acquaintances. When, however, her new life was beginning to lose its newness, and when her old acquaintances came to see her, her present surroundings became more like her past, and on this she herself began to get like her past too. At first she only got a little tipsy and struggled against a relapse, but it was no use, she soon lost the heart to fight, and now her object was not to try and keep sober, but to get gin without her husband's finding it out. So the hysterics continued, and she managed to make her husband still think that they were due to her being about to become a mother. The worse her attacks were, the more devoted he became in his attention to her. At last he insisted that a doctor should see her. The doctor of course took in the situation at a glance, but said nothing to Ernest except in such a guarded way that he did not understand the hints that were thrown out to him. He was much too downright and matter-of-fact to be quick at taking hints of this sort. He hoped that as soon as his wife's confinement was over she would regain her health, and had no thought save how to spare her as far as possible, till that happy time should come. In the mornings she was generally better, as long, that is to say, as Ernest remained at home, but he had to go out buying, and on his return would generally find that she had had another attack as soon as he had left the house. At times she would laugh and cry for half an hour together, at others she would lie in a semi-comatose state upon the bed, and when he came back he would find that the shop had been neglected and all the work of the household left undone. Still he took it for granted that this was all part of the usual course when women were going to become mothers, and when Ellen's share of the work settled down more and more upon his own shoulders, he did it all and drudged away without a murmur. Nevertheless, he began to feel in a vague way more as he had felt in Ashpit Place, at Roughborough, or at Battersby, and to lose the buoyancy of spirits which had made another man of him during the first 6 months of his married life. It was not only that he had to do so much household work, for even the cooking, cleaning up slops, bed-making and fire-lighting ere long devolved upon him, but his business no longer prospered. He could buy as hitherto, but Ellen seemed unable to sell as she had sold at first. The fact was that she sold as well as ever, but kept back part of the proceeds in order to buy gin, and she did this more and more till even the unsuspecting Ernest ought to have seen that she was not telling the truth. When she sold better, that is to say, when she did not think it safe to keep back more than a certain amount, she got money out of him on the plea that she had a longing for this or that, and that it would perhaps irreparably damage the baby if her longing was denied her. All seemed right, reasonable, and unavoidable. Nevertheless Ernest saw that until the confinement was over he was likely to have a hard time of it. All, however, would then come right again. Chapter 75. In the month of September 1860 a girl was born, and Ernest was proud and happy. The birth of the child, and a rather alarming talk which the doctor had given to Ellen, sobered her for a few weeks, and it really seemed as though his hopes were about to be fulfilled. The expenses of his wife's confinement were heavy, and he was obliged to trench upon his savings, but he had no doubt about soon recouping this now that Ellen was herself again. For a time indeed his business did revive a little. Nevertheless it seemed as though the interruption to his prosperity had in some way broken the spell of good luck which had attended him in the outset. He was still sanguine, however, and worked night and day with a will, but there was no more music or reading or writing now. His Sunday outings were put a stop to, and but for the first floor being let to myself, he would have lost his citadel there too, but he seldom used it, for Ellen had to wait more and more upon the baby, and as a consequence Ernest had to wait more and more upon Ellen. One afternoon, about a couple of months after the baby had been born, and just as my unhappy hero was beginning to feel more hopeful and therefore better able to bear his burdens, he returned from a sale, and found Ellen in the same hysterical condition that he had found her in the spring. She said she was again with child, and Ernest still believed her. All the troubles of the preceding 6 months began again then and there, and grew worse and worse continually. Money did not come in quickly, for Ellen cheated him by keeping it back, and dealing improperly with the goods he bought. When it did come in she got it out of him as before on pretexts which it seemed inhuman to inquire into. It was always the same story. By and by a new feature began to show itself. Ernest had inherited his father's punctuality and exactness as regards money. He liked to know the worst of what he had to pay at once. He hated having expenses sprung upon him which if not foreseen might and ought to have been so, but now bills began to be brought to him for things ordered by Ellen without his knowledge, or for which he had already given her the money. This was awful, and even Ernest turned. When he remonstrated with her not for having bought the things, but for having said nothing to him about the money's being owing, Ellen met him with hysteria, and there was a scene. She had now pretty well forgot the hard times she had known when she had been on her own resources, and reproached him downright with having married Heron. That moment the scales fell from Ernest's eyes, as they had fallen when Towneley had said no, no, no. He said nothing, but he woke up once for all to the fact that he had made a mistake in marrying. A touch had again come which had revealed him to himself. He went upstairs to the disused citadel, flung himself into the armchair, and covered his face with his hands. He still did not know that his wife drank, but he could no longer trust her, and his dream of happiness was over. He had been saved from the church so as by fire, but still saved but what could now save him from his marriage. He had made the same mistake that he had made in wedding himself to the church, but with 100 times worse results. He had learnt nothing by experience. He was an esron of those wretches whose hearts the Lord had hardened, who having ears heard not, having eyes saw not, and who should find no place for repentance though they sought it even with tears. Yet had he not on the whole tried to find out what the ways of God were, and to follow them in singleness of heart? To a certain extent, yes, but he had not been thorough, he had not given up all for God. He knew that very well he had done little as compared with what he might and ought to have done, but still if he was being punished for this, God was a hard taskmaster, and one too, who was continually pouncing out upon his unhappy creatures from ambuscades. In marrying Ellen he had meant to avoid a life of sin, and to take the course he believed to be moral and right. With his antecedents and surroundings, it was the most natural thing in the world for him to have done, yet in what a frightful position had not his morality landed him? Could any amount of immorality have placed him in a much worse one? What was morality worth if it was not that which on the whole brought a man peace at the last, and could anyone have reasonable certainty that marriage would do this? It seemed to him that in his attempt to be moral he had been following a devil which had disguised itself as an angel of light. But if so, what ground was there on which a man might rest the sole of his foot and tread in reasonable safety? He was still too young to reach the answer, on common sensian answer, which he would have felt to be unworthy of anyone who had an ideal standard. However this might be, it was plain that he had now done for himself. It had been thus with him all his life. If there had come at any time a gleam of sunshine and hope, it was to be obscured immediately. Prison was happier than this. There, at any rate, he had had no money anxieties, and these were beginning to weigh upon him now with all their horrors. He was happier even now than he had been at Battersby or at Roughborough, and he would not now go back, even if he could, to his Cambridge life, but for all that the outlook was so gloomy, in fact so hopeless, that he felt as if he could have only too gladly gone to sleep and died in his armchair once for all. As he was musing thus, and looking upon the wreck of his hopes for, he saw well enough that as long as he was linked to Ellen, he should never rise as he had dreamed of doing. Heard a noise below, and presently a neighbour ran upstairs and entered his room hurriedly. "Good gracious, Mr. Pontifex," she exclaimed, "for goodness' sake come down quickly and help. Oh, Mrs. Pontifex is took with the horrorsan she's orchard." The unhappy man came down as he was bid, and found his wife mad with delirium tremens. He knew all now. The neighbours thought he must have known that his wife drank all along, but Ellen had been so artful and he so simple that, as I have said, he had had no suspicion. "Why," said the woman who had summoned him, "she'll drink anything she can stand up and pay her money for." Ernest could hardly believe his ears, but when the doctor had seen his wife and she had become more quiet, he went over to the public house hard by and made inquiries, the result of which rendered further doubt impossible. The publican took the opportunity to present my hero with a bill of several pounds for bottles of spirits supplied to his wife, and what with his wife's confinement and the way business had fallen off, he had not the money to pay with, for the sum exceeded the remnant of his savings. He came to Menot for money, but to tell me his miserable story. I had seen for some time that there was something wrong, and had suspected pretty shrewdly what the matter was, but of course I said nothing. Ernest and I had been growing apart for some time. I was vexed at his having married, and he knew I was vexed, though I did my best to hide it. A man's friendships are, like his will, invalidated by marriage, but they are also no less invalidated by the marriage of his friends. The rift in friendship which invariably makes its appearance on the marriage of either of the parties to it was fast widening, as it no less invariably does, into the great gulf which is fixed between the married and the unmarried, and I was beginning to leave my protégé to a fate with which I had neither right nor power to meddle. In fact, I had begun to feel him rather a burden. I did not so much mind this when I could be of use, but I grudged it when I could be of none. He had made his bed, and he must lie upon it. Ernest had felt all this and had seldom come near me till now. One evening late in 1860 he called on me, and with a very woebegone face told me his troubles. As soon as I found that he no longer liked his wife, I forgave him at once, and was as much interested in him as ever. There is nothing an old bachelor likes better than to find a young married man who wishes he had not got married, especially when the case is such an extreme one that he need not pretend to hope that matters will come all right again, or encourage his young friend to make the best of it. I was myself in favour of a separation, and said I would make Ellen an allowance myself, of course, intending that it should come out of Ernest's money, but he would not hear of this. He had married Ellen, he said, and he must try to reform her. He hated it, but he must try, and finding him as usual very obstinate, I was obliged to acquiesce, though with little confidence as to the result. I was vexed at seeing him waste himself upon such a barren task, and again began to feel him burdensome. I am afraid I showed this, for he again avoided me for some time, and indeed, for many months I hardly saw him at all. Ellen remained very ill for some days, and then gradually recovered. Ernest hardly left her till she was out of danger. When she had recovered, he got the doctor to tell her that if she had such another attack she would certainly die. This so frightened her that she took the pledge. Then he became more hopeful again. When she was sober, she was just what she was during the first days of her married life, and so quick was he to forget pain, that after a few days he was as fond of her as ever. But Ellen could not forgive him for knowing what he 999. She knew that he was on the watch to shield her from temptation, and though he did his best to make her think that he had no further uneasiness about her, she found the burden of her union with respectability grow more and more heavy upon her, and looked back more and more longingly upon the lawless freedom of the life she had led before she met her husband. I will dwell no longer on this part of my story. During the spring months of 1861 she kept straight had had her fling of dissipation, and this, together with the impression made upon her by her having taken the pledge, tamed her for a while. The shop went fairly well, and enabled Ernest to make the two ends meet. In the spring and summer of 1861 he even put by a little money again. In the autumn his wife was confined of a boy, a very fine one, so everyone said. She soon recovered, and Ernest was beginning to breathe freely and be almost sanguine when, without a word of warning, the storm broke again. He returned one afternoon about 2 years after his marriage, and found his wife lying upon the floor insensible. From this time he became hopeless, and began to go visibly downhill. He had been knocked about too much, and the luck had gone too long against him. The wear and tear of the last 3 years had told on him, and though not actually ill, he was overworked, below par, and unfit for any further burden. He struggled for a while to prevent himself from finding this out, but facts were too strong for him. Again he called on me and told me what had happened. I was glad the crisis had come. I was sorry for Ellen, but a complete separation from her was the only chance for her husband. Even after this last outbreak he was unwilling to consent to this, and talked nonsense about dying at his post, till I got tired of him. Each time I saw him, the old gloom had settled more and more deeply upon his face, and I had about made up my mind to put an end to the situation by a coup de main, such as bribing Ellen to run away with somebody else, or something of that kind, when matters settled themselves as usual in a way which I had not anticipated. Chapter 76. The winter had been a trying one. Ernest had only paid his way by selling his piano. With this he seemed to cut away the last link that connected him with his earlier life, and to sink once for all into the small shopkeeper. It seemed to him that however low he might sink his pain could not last much longer, for he should simply die if it 999. He hated Ellen now, and the pair lived in open want of harmony with each other. If it had not been for his children, he would have left her and gone to America, but he could not leave the children with Ellen, and as for taking them with him, he did not know how to do it, nor what to do with them when he had got them to America. If he had not lost energy, he would probably in the end have taken the children and gone off, but his nerve was shaken, so day after day went by and nothing was done. He had only got a few shillings in the world now, except the value of his stock, which was very little. He could get perhaps 3 or 4 by selling his music, and what few pictures and pieces of furniture still belonged to him. He thought of trying to live by his pen, but his writing had dropped off long ago. He no longer had an idea in his head. Look which way he would, he saw no hope. The end, if it had not actually come, was within easy distance, and he was almost face to face with actual want. When he saw people going about poorly clad, or even without shoes and stockings, he wondered whether within a few months' time he too should not have to go about in this way. The remorseless, resistless hand of fate had caught him in its grip, and was dragging him down, down, down. Still he staggered on, going his daily rounds, buying second-hand clothes, and spending his evenings in cleaning and mending them. One morning, as he was returning from a house at the West End, where he had bought some clothes from one of the servants, he was struck by a small crowd which had gathered round a space that had been railed off on the grass near one of the paths in the Green Park. It was a lovely soft spring morning at the end of March, and unusually balmy for the time of year. Even Ernest's melancholy was relieved for a while by the look of spring that pervaded earth and sky, but it soon returned, and smiling sadly he said to himself, "It may bring hope to others, but for me there can be no hope henceforth." As these words were in his mind, he joined the small crowd who were gathered round the railings, and saw that they were looking at 3 sheep with very small lambs only a day or 2 old, which had been penned off for shelter and protection from the others that ranged the park. They were very pretty, and Londoners so seldom get a chance of seeing lambs that it was no wonder everyone stopped to look at them. Ernest observed that no one seemed fonder of them than a great lubberly butcher boy, who leaned up against the railings with a tray of meat upon his shoulder. He was looking at this boy and smiling at the grotesqueness of his admiration, when he became aware that he was being watched intently by a man in coachman's livery, who had also stopped to admire the lambs, and was leaning against the opposite side of the enclosure. Ernest knew him in a moment as John, his father's old coachman at Battersby, and went up to him at once. "Why, Master Ernest," said he, with his strong northern accent, "I was thinking of you only this very morning," and the pair shook hands heartily. John was in an excellent place at the West End. He had done very well, he said, ever since he had left Battersby, except for the first year or 2, and that, he said with a screw of the face, had well nigh broke him. Ernest asked how this was. "Why, you see," said John, "I was always main fond of that lass Ellen, whom you remember running after, Master Ernest, and giving your watch to. I expect you haven't forgotten that day, have you?" And here he laughed. "I don't know as I be the father of the child she carried away with her from Battersby, but I very easily may have been. Anyhow, after I had left your papa's place a few days, I wrote to Ellen to an address we had agreed upon, and told her I would do what I ought to do, and so I did, for I married her within a month afterwards. Why, Lord love the man, whatever is the matter with him," for as he had spoken the last few words of his story Ernest had turned white as a sheet, and was leaning against the railings. "John," said my hero, gasping for breath, "are you sure of what you say? Are you quite sure you really married her?" "Of course I am," said John. "I married her before the registrar at Lechbury on the 15th of August 1851. "Give me your arm," said Ernest, "and take me into Piccadilly, and put me into a cab, and come with me at once, if you can spare time, to Mr. Overton's at the Temple." Chapter 77. I do not think Ernest himself was much more pleased at finding that he had never been married than I was. To him, however, the shock of pleasure was positively numbing in its intensity. As he felt his burden removed, he reeled for the unaccustomed lightness of his movements. His position was so shattered that his identity seemed to have been shattered also. He was as one waking up from a horrible nightmare to find himself safe and sound in bed, but who can hardly even yet believe that the room is not full of armed men who are about to spring upon him. "And it is I," he said, "who not an hour ago complained that I was without hope. It is I, who for weeks have been railing at fortune, and saying that though she smiled on others she never smiled at me. Why, never was anyone half so fortunate as I am." "Yes," said I, "you have been inoculated for marriage, and have recovered." "And yet," he said, "I was very fond of her till she took to drinking." "Perhaps, but is it not Tennyson who has said, 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have lost at all'?" "You are an inveterate bachelor," was the rejoinder. Then we had a long talk with John, to whom I gave a 5 note upon the spot. He said Ellen had used to drink at Battersby. The cook had taught her. He had known it, but was so fond of her that he had chanced it and married her to save her from the streets, and in the hope of being able to keep her straight. She had done with him just as she had done with Ernest, made him an excellent wife as long as she kept sober, but a very bad one afterwards. "There isn't," said John, "a sweeter-tempered, handier, prettier girl than she was in all England, nor one as knows better what a man likes, and how to make him happy if you can keep her from drink. But you can't keep her. She's that artful shell get it under your very eyes without you knowing it. If she can't get any more of your things to pawn or sell, she'll steal her neighbours. That's how she got into trouble first when I was with her." During the 6 months she was in prison I should have felt happy if I had not known she would come out again. And then she did come out, and before she had been free a fortnight, she began shoplifting and going on the loose again and all to get money to drink with. So seeing I could do nothing with her and that she was just a killing of me, I left her, and came up to London and went into service again, and I did not know what had become of her till you and Mr. Ernest here told me. I hope y'all neither of you say you've seen me. We assured him we would keep his counsel, and then he left us with many protestations of affection towards Ernest, to whom he had been always much attached. We talked the situation over, and decided first to get the children away, and then to come to terms with Ellen concerning their future custody. As for herself, I proposed that we should make her an allowance of, say, £1 a week to be paid so long as she gave no trouble. Ernest did not see where the £1 a week was to come from, so I eased his mind by saying I would pay it myself. Before the day was 2 hours older we had got the children, about whom Ellen had always appeared to be indifferent, and had confided them to the care of my laundress, a good motherly sort of woman, who took to them and to whom they took at once. Then came the odious task of getting rid of their unhappy mother. Ernest's heart smote him at the notion of the shock the break-up would be to her. He was always thinking that people had a claim upon him for some inestimable service they had rendered him, or for some irreparable mischief done to them by himself. The case, however, was so clear that Ernest's scruples did not offer serious resistance. I did not see why he should have the pain of another interview with his wife, so I got Mr. Ottery to manage the whole business. It turned out that we need not have harrowed ourselves so much about the agony of mind which Ellen would suffer on becoming an outcast again. Ernest saw Mrs. Richards, the neighbour who had called him down on the night when he had first discovered his wife's drunkenness, and got from her some details of Ellen's opinions upon the matter. She did not seem in the least conscience-stricken, she said, thank goodness at last, and although aware that her marriage was not a valid one, evidently regarded this as a mere detail which it would not be worth anybody's while to go into more particularly. As regards his breaking with her, she said it was a good job both for him and for her. This life, she continued, don't suit me. Ernest is too good for me. He wants a woman as shall be a bit better than me, and I want a man that shall be a bit worse than him. We should have got on all very well if we had not lived together as married folks, but I've been used to have a little place of my own, however small, for many years, and I don't want Ernest or any other man always hanging about it. Besides, he is too steady. His being in prison hasn't done him a bit of good, has just as grave as those as have never been in prison at all, and he never swears nor curses, come what may. It makes me afeard of him, and therefore I drink the worse. What us poor girls wants is not to be jumped up all of a sudden and made honest women of. This is too much for us and throws us off our perch. What we wants is a regular friend or two, who'll just keep us from starving and force us to be good for a bit together now and again. That's about as much as we can stand. He may have the children, he can do better for them than I can, and as for his money he may give it or keep it as he likes. He's never done me any harm and I shall let him alone. But if he means me to have it, I suppose I'd better have it, and have it she 999. And I, thought Ernest to himself again when the arrangement was concluded, am the man who thought himself unlucky. I may as well say here all that need be said further about Ellen. For the next 3 years she used to call regularly at Mr. Ottery's every Monday morning for her £1. She was always neatly dressed, and looked so quiet and pretty that no one would have suspected her antecedents. At first she wanted sometimes to anticipate, but after 3 or 4 ineffectual attempts, in each of which occasions she told a most pitiful story, she gave it up, and took her money regularly without a word. Once she came with a bad black eye, which a boy had thrown a stone and hit her by mistake, but on the whole she looked pretty much the same at the end of the 3 years as she had done at the beginning. Then she explained that she was going to be married again. Mr. Ottery saw her on this, and pointed out to her that she would very likely be again committing bigamy by doing so. You may call it what you like, she replied, but I am going off to America with Bill the butcher's man, and we hope Mr. Pontifex won't be too hard on us and stop the allowance. Ernest was little likely to do this, so the pair went in peace. I believe it was Bill who had blacked her eye, and she liked him all the better for it. From 1 or 2 little things, I have been able to gather that the couple got on very well together, and that in Bill she has found a partner better suited to her than either John or Ernest. On his birthday, Ernest generally receives an envelope with an American postmark containing a bookmarker with a flaunting text upon it, or a moral kettle holder, or some other similar small token of recognition, but no letter. Of the children she has taken no notice. Chapter 78. Ernest was now well turned 26 years old, and in little more than another year and a half would come into possession of his money. I saw no reason for letting him have it earlier than the date fixed by Miss Pontifex herself. At the same time, I did not like his continuing the shop at Blackfriars after the present crisis. It was not till now that I fully understood how much he had suffered, nor how nearly his supposed wife's habits had brought him to actual want. I had indeed noted the old worn look settling upon his face, but was either too indolent or too hopeless of being able to sustain a protracted and successful warfare with Ellen to extend the sympathy and make the inquiries which I suppose I ought to have made. And yet I hardly know what I could have done, for nothing short of his finding out what he had found out would have detached him from his wife, and nothing could do him much good as long as he continued to live with her. After all, I suppose I was right. I suppose things did turn out all the better in the end for having been left to settle themselves at any rate whether they did or did not. The whole thing was in too great a muddle for me to venture to tackle it so long as Ellen was upon the scene. Now, however, that she was removed, all my interest in my godson revived, and I turned over many times in my mind what I had better do with him. It was now 3.5 years since he had come up to London and begun to live, so to speak, upon his own account. Of these years, 6 months had been spent as a clergyman, 6 months in jail, and for 2.5 years he had been acquiring twofold experience in the ways of business and of marriage. He had failed, I may say, in everything that he had undertaken, even as a prisoner. Yet his defeats had been always, as it seemed to me, something so like victories, that I was satisfied of his being worth all the pains I could bestow upon him. My only fear was lest I should meddle with him when it might be better for him to be let alone. On the whole, I concluded that a 3.5 years' apprenticeship to a rough life was enough. The shop had done much for him. It had kept him going after a fashion when he was in great need. It had thrown him upon his own resources and taught him to see profitable openings all around him, where a few months before he would have seen nothing but insuperable difficulties. It had enlarged his sympathies by making him understand the lower classes, and not confining his view of life to that taken by gentlemen only. When he went about the streets and saw the books outside the second-hand bookstalls, the bric-a-brac in the curiosity shops, and the infinite commercial activity which is omnipresent around us, he understood it and sympathized with it, as he could never have done if he had not kept a shop himself. He has often told me that when he used to travel on a railway that overlooked populous suburbs, and looked down upon street after street of dingy houses, he used to wonder what kind of people lived in them, what they did and felt, and how far it was like what he did and felt himself. Now, he said, he knew all about it. I am not very familiar with the writer of the Odyssey who, by the way, I suspect strongly of having been a clergyman, but he assuredly hit the right nail on the head when he epitomized his typical wise man as knowing the ways and farings of many men. What culture is comparable to this? What a lie, what a sickly debilitating debauch did not Ernest's school and university career now seem to him, in comparison with his life in prison and as a tailor in Blackfriars. I have heard him say he would have gone through all he had suffered if it were only for the deeper insight it gave him into the spirit of the Grecian and the Surrey pantomimes. What confidence again in his own power to swim if thrown into deep waters had not he won through his experiences during the last 3 years? But as I have said, I thought my godson had now seen as much of the undercurrents of life as was likely to be of use to him, and that it was time he began to live in a style more suitable to his prospects. His aunt had wished him to kiss the soil, and he had kissed it with a vengeance, but I did not like the notion of his coming suddenly from the position of a small shopkeeper to that of a man with an income of between 3,000 and 4,000 a year. Too sudden a jump from bad fortune to good is just as dangerous as one from good to bad. Besides, poverty is very wearing. It is a quasi-embryonic condition, through which a man had better pass if he is to hold his later developments securely, but like measles or scarlet fever, he had better have it mildly and get it over early. No man is safe from losing every penny he has in the world, unless he has had his facer. How often do I not hear middle-aged women and quiet family men say that they have no speculative tendency, they never had touched and never would touch any but the very soundest, best-reputed investments, and as for unlimited liability, oh dear, dear, and they throw up their hands and eyes. Whenever a person is heard to talk thus, he may be recognized as the easy prey of the first adventurer who comes across him. He will commonly, indeed, wind up his discourse by saying that in spite of all his natural caution, and his well knowing how foolish speculation is, yet there are some investments which are called speculative, but in reality are not so, and he will pull out of his pocket the prospectus of a Cornish gold mine. It is only on having actually lost money that one realizes what an awful thing the loss of it is, and finds out how easily it is lost by those who venture out of the middle of the most beaten path. Ernest had had his facer, as he had had his attack of poverty, young, and sufficiently badly for a sensible man to be little likely to forget it. I can fancy few pieces of good fortune greater than this as happening to any man, provided, of course, that he is not damaged irretrievably. So strongly do I feel on this subject that if I had my way I would have a speculation master attached to every school. The boys would be encouraged to read the Money Market Review, the Railway News, and all the best financial papers, and should establish a stock exchange amongst themselves in which pence should stand as pounds. Then let them see how this making haste to get rich moneys out in actual practice. There might be a prize awarded by the headmaster to the most prudent dealer, and the boys who lost their money time after time should be dismissed. Of course, if any boy proved to have a genius for speculation and made money well and good, let him speculate by all means. If universities were not the worst teachers in the world, I should like to see professorships of speculation established at Oxford and Cambridge. When I reflect, however, that the only things worth doing which Oxford and Cambridge can do well are cooking, cricket, rowing and games, of which there is no professorship, I fear that the establishment of a professorial chair would end in teaching young men neither how to speculate, nor how not to speculate, but would simply turn them out as bad speculators. I heard of one case in which a father actually carried my idea into practice. He wanted his son to learn how little confidence was to be placed in glowing prospectuses and flaming articles, and found him £500, which he was to invest according to his lights. The father expected he would lose the money, but it did not turn out so in practice, for the boy took so much pains and played so cautiously that the money kept growing and growing till the father took it away again, increment and allers, he was pleased to say, in self-defence. I had made my own mistakes with money about the year 1846, when everyone else was making them. For a few years I had been so scared and had suffered so severely, that when, owing to the good advice of the broker who had advised my father and grandfather before me, I came out in the end a winner and not a loser, I played no more pranks, but kept henceforward as nearly in the middle of the middle rut as I could. I tried in fact to keep my money rather than to make more of it. I had done with Ernest's money as with my own, that is to say, I had let it alone after investing it in Midland ordinary stock, according to Miss Pontifex's instructions. No amount of trouble would have been likely to have increased my godson's estate one half so much as it had increased without my taking any trouble at all. Midland stock at the end of August 1850, when I sold out Miss Pontifex's debentures, stood at 32 per 100. I invested the whole of Ernest's 15,000 at this price, and did not change the investment till a few months before the time of which I have been writing lately, that is to say, until September 1861. I then sold at 129 per share, and invested in London and Northwestern ordinary stock, which I was advised was more likely to rise than Midlands now were. I bought the London and Northwestern stock at 93 per 100, and my godson now in 1882 still holds it. The original 15,000 had increased in 11 years to over 60,000. The accumulated interest, which of course I had reinvested, had come to about 10,000 more, so that Ernest was then worth over 70,000. At present he is worth nearly double that sum, and all as the result of leaving well alone. Large as his property now was, it ought to be increased still further during the year and a half that remained of his minority, so that on coming of age he ought to have an income of at least 3,500 a year. I wished him to understand bookkeeping by double entry. I had myself as a young man been compelled to master this not very difficult art. Having acquired it, I have become enamoured of it, and consider it the most necessary branch of any young man's education after reading and writing. I was determined, therefore, that Ernest should master it, and proposed that he should become my steward, bookkeeper, and the manager of my hoardings, for so I called the sum which my ledger showed to have accumulated from 15,000 to 70,000. I told him I was going to begin to spend the income as soon as it had amounted up to 80,000. A few days after Ernest's discovery that he was still a bachelor, while he was still at the very beginning of the honeymoon, as it were, of his renewed unmarried life, I broached my scheme, desired him to give up his shop, and offered him 300 a year for managing so far indeed as it required any managing his own property. This 300 a year, I need hardly say, I made him charge to the estate. If anything had been wanting to complete his happiness, it was this. Here, within 3 or 4 days, he found himself freed from one of the most hideous, hopeless liaisons imaginable, and at the same time raised from a life of almost squalor to the enjoyment of what would to him be a handsome income. £1 a week, he thought, for Ellen, and the rest for myself. No, said I, we will charge Ellen's £1 a week to the estate also. You must have a clear 300 for yourself. I fixed upon this sum, because it was the one which Mr. Disraeli gave Coningsby when Coningsby was at the lowest ebb of his fortunes. Mr. Disraeli evidently thought 300 a year the smallest sum on which Coningsby could be expected to live, and make the two ends meet. With this, however, he thought his hero could manage to get along for a year or two. In 1862, of which I am now writing, prices had risen, though not so much as they have since done. On the other hand, Ernest had had less expensive antecedents than Coningsby, so on the whole I thought 300 a year would be about the right thing for him. Chapter 79. The question now arose what was to be done with the children. I explained to Ernest that their expenses must be charged to the estate, and showed him how small a hole all the various items I proposed to charge would make in the income at my disposal. He was beginning to make difficulties, when I quieted him by pointing out that the money had all come to me from his aunt, over his own head, and reminded him there had been an understanding between her and me that I should do much as I was doing, if occasion should arise. He wanted his children to be brought up in the fresh pure air, and among other children who were happy and contented, but being still ignorant of the fortune that awaited him, he insisted that they should pass their earlier years among the poor rather than the rich. I remonstrated, but he was very decided about it, and when I reflected that they were illegitimate, I was not sure but that what Ernest proposed might be as well for everyone in the end. They were still so young that it did not much matter where they were, so long as they were with kindly, decent people, and in a healthy neighborhood. I shall be just as unkind to my children, he said, as my grandfather was to my father or my father to me. If they did not succeed in making their children love them, neither shall one. I say to myself that I should like to do so, but so did they. I can make sure that they shall not know how much they would have hated me if they had had much to do with me, but this is all I can do. If I must ruin their prospects, let me do so at a reasonable time before they are old enough to feel it. He mused a little and added with a laugh, a man first quarrels with his father about 3/4 of a year before he is born. It is then he insists on setting up a separate establishment. When this has been once agreed to, the more complete the separation for ever after the better for both. Then he said more seriously, I want to put the children where they will be well and happy, and where they will not be betrayed into the misery of false expectations. In the end, he remembered that on his Sunday walks he had more than once seen a couple who lived on the waterside a few miles below Gravesend, just where the sea was beginning, and who he thought would do. They had a family of their own fast coming on, and the children seemed to thrive. Both father and mother indeed were comfortable, well-grown folks, in whose hands young people would be likely to have as fair a chance of coming to a good development as in those of any whom he knew. We went down to see this couple, and as I thought no less well of them than Ernest did, we offered them £1 a week to take the children and bring them up as though they were their own. They jumped at the offer, and in another day or two we brought the children down and left them, feeling that we had done as well as we could by them, at any rate for the present. Then Ernest sent his small stock of goods to Debenhams, gave up the house he had taken 2.5 years previously, and returned to civilization. I had expected that he would now rapidly recover, and was disappointed to see him get, as I thought, decidedly worse. Indeed, before long I thought him looking so ill that I insisted on his going with me to consult one of the most eminent doctors in London. This gentleman said there was no acute disease, but that my young friend was suffering from nervous prostration, the result of long and severe mental suffering, from which there was no remedy except time, prosperity, and rest. He said that Ernest must have broken down later on, but that he might have gone on for some months yet. It was the suddenness of the relief from tension which had knocked him over now. "Cross him," said the doctor at once. "Crossing is the great medical discovery of the age. Shake him out of himself by shaking something else into him." I had not told him that money was no object to us, and I think he had reckoned me up as not over-rich. He continued. "Seeing is a mode of touching is a mode of feeding is a mode of assimilation is a mode of recreation and reproduction, and this is crossing, shaking yourself into something else and something else into you." He spoke laughingly, but it was plain he was serious. He continued. "People are always coming to me who want crossing, or change if you prefer it, and who I know have not money enough to let them get away from London. This has set me thinking how I can best cross them even if they cannot leave home, and I have made a list of cheap London amusements which I recommend to my patients. None of them cost more than a few shillings, or take more than half a day or a day." I explained that there was no occasion to consider money in this case. "I am glad of it," he said, still laughing. "The homeopathists use aurum as a medicine, but they do not give it in large doses enough. If you can dose your young friend with this pretty freely, you will soon bring him round. However, Mr. Pontifex is not well enough to stand so great a change as going abroad yet. From what you tell me, I should think he had had as much change lately as is good for him. If he were to go abroad now, he would probably be taken seriously ill within a week. We must wait till he has recovered tone a little more. I will begin by ringing my London changes on him." He thought a little and then said, "I have found the zoological gardens of service to many of my patients. I should prescribe for Mr. Pontifex a course of the larger mammals. Don't let him think he is taking them medicinally, but let him go to their house twice a week for a fortnight, and stay with the hippopotamus, the rhinoceros, and the elephants, till they begin to bore him. I find these beasts do my patients more good than any others. The monkeys are not a wide enough cross, they do not stimulate sufficiently. The larger carnivora are unsympathetic. The reptiles are worse than useless, and the marsupials are not much better. Birds again, except parrots, are not very beneficial. He may look at them now and again, but with the elephants and the pig tribe generally he should mix just now as freely as possible. Then, to prevent monotony, I should send him, say, to morning service at the Abbey before he goes. He need not stay longer than the Te Deum. I don't know why, but jubilates are seldom satisfactory. Just let him look in at the Abbey and sit quietly in Poet's Corner till the main part of the music is over. Let him do this 2 or 3 times, not more, before he goes to the zoo. Then next day send him down to Gravesend by boat. By all means let him go to the theatres in the evenings, and then let him come to me again in a fortnight." Had the doctor been less eminent in his profession, I should have doubted whether he was in earnest, but I knew him to be a man of business who would neither waste his own time nor that of his patients. As soon as we were out of the house, we took a cab to Regent's Park, and spent a couple of hours in sauntering round the different houses. Perhaps it was on account of what the doctor had told me, but I certainly became aware of a feeling I had never experienced before. I mean that I was receiving an influx of new life, or deriving new ways of looking at life, which is the same thing be the process. I found the doctor quite right in his estimate of the larger mammals, as the ones which on the whole were most beneficial, and observed that Ernest, who had heard nothing of what the doctor had said to me, lingered instinctively in front of them. As for the elephants, especially the baby elephant, he seemed to be drinking in large draughts of their lives to the recreation and regeneration of his own. We dined in the gardens, and I noticed with pleasure that Ernest's appetite was already improved. Since this time, whenever I have been a little out of sorts myself, I have at once gone up to Regent's Park, and have invariably been benefited. I mention this here in the hope that some one or other of my readers may find the hint a useful one. At the end of his fortnight, my hero was much better, more so even than our friend the doctor had expected. Now, he said, Mr. Pontifex may go abroad, and the sooner the better. Let him stay a couple of months. This was the first Ernest had heard about his going abroad, and he talked about my not being able to spare him for so long. I soon made this all right. "It is now the beginning of April," said I. "Go down to Marseille at once and take steamer to Nice. Then saunter down the Riviera to Genoa. From Genoa go to Florence, Rome, and Naples, and come home by way of Venice and the Italian lakes." "And won't you come too?" said he eagerly. I said I did not mind if I did, so we began to make our arrangements next morning, and completed them within a very few days. Chapter 80. We left by the night mail, crossing from Dover. The night was soft and there was a bright moon upon the sea. Don't you love the smell of grease about the engine of a Channel steamer? Isn't there a lot of hope in it? Said Ernest to me, for he had been to Normandy one summer as a boy with his father and mother, and the smell carried him back to days before those in which he had begun to bruise himself against the great outside world. I always think one of the best parts of going abroad is the first thud of the piston, and the first gurgling of the water when the paddle begins to strike it. It was very dreamy getting out at Calais, and trudging about with luggage in a foreign town at an hour when we were generally both of us in bed and fast asleep. But we settled down to sleep as soon as we got into the railway carriage, and dozed till we had passed Amiens. Then waking when the first signs of morning crispness were beginning to show themselves, I saw that Ernest was already devouring every object we passed with quick sympathetic curiousness. There was not a peasant in a blouse driving his cart betimes along the road to market, not a signalman's wife in her husband's hat and coat waving a green flag, not a shepherd taking out his sheep to the dewy pastures, not a bank of opening cowslips as we passed through the railway cuttings, but he was drinking it all in with an enjoyment too deep for words. The name of the engine that drew us was Mozart, and Ernest liked this too. We reached Paris by 6, and had just time to get across the town and take a morning express train to Marseille, but before noon my young friend was tired out and had resigned himself to a series of sleeps which were seldom intermitted for more than an hour or so together. He fought against this for a time, but in the end consoled himself by saying it was so nice to have so much pleasure that he could afford to throw a lot of it away. Having found a theory on which to justify himself, he slept in peace. At Marseille we rested, and there the excitement of the change proved, as I had half feared it would, too much for my godson's still enfeebled state. For a few days he was really ill, but after this he righted. For my own part, reckon being ill as one of the great pleasures of life, provided one is not too ill and is not obliged to work till one is better. I remember being ill once in a foreign hotel myself, and how much I enjoyed it. To lie there careless of everything, quiet and warm, and with no weight upon the mind, to hear the clinking of the plates in the far-off kitchen as the scullion rinsed them and put them by, to watch the soft shadows come and go upon the ceiling as the sun came out or went behind a cloud, to listen to the pleasant murmuring of the fountain in the court below, and the shaking of the bells on the horses' collars and the clink of their hoofs upon the ground as the flies plagued them, not only to be a Latouciator, but to know that it was one's duty to be a Latouciator. Oh, I thought to myself, if I could only now, having so forgotten care, drop off to sleep forever, would not this be a better piece of fortune than any I can ever hope for? Of course it would, but we would not take it though it were offered us. No matter what evil may befall us, we will mostly abide by it and see it out. I could see that Ernest felt much as I had felt myself. He said little but noted everything. Once only did he frighten me. He called me to his bedside just as it was getting dusk, and said in a grave, quiet manner that he should like to speak to me. I have been thinking, he said, that I may perhaps never recover from this illness, and in case I do not I should like you to know that there is only one thing which weighs upon me. I refer, he continued after a slight pause, to my conduct towards my father and mother. I have been much too good to them. I treated them much too considerately, on which he broke into a smile which assured me that there was nothing seriously amiss with him. On the walls of his bedroom were a series of French Revolution prints representing events in the life of Lycurgus. There was Grandeur Dame de Lycurgue, and Lycurgue consult l'oracle, and then there was Calciope la Cour. Under this was written in French and Spanish, Model de Grace et de But, la June Calciope non moins, sage que belle avait mérite, leste met l'attachement du vertu à Lycurgue. Vivement épris de tant de charmes, l'illustre philosophe la conduisait dans le temple de Junon, aux ils s'unirent par un serment sacre. Après cette auguste cérémonie, Lycurgue s'empressa de conduire sa jeune épouse au palais de son frère Polydecte, roi de l'Estémen. Seigneur, lui dit-il, la vertus Calciope vint de recevoir mis voix oxpides des hôtels, osez-vous prier d'approuver cette union? Le roi temigne d'abord quelque surprise, mais l'estim quil avait pour son frère lui inspire une réponse pleine de bienveillance. Il s'approcha aussitôt de Calciope quil embrassa tendrement, comblant sut Lycurgue de prévenances, et parut très satisfait. He called my attention to this, and then said somewhat timidly that he would rather have married Ellen than Calciope. I saw he was hardening, and made no hesitation about proposing that in another day or two we should proceed upon our journey. I will not weary the reader by taking him with us over beaten ground. We stopped at Siena, Cortona, Orvieto, Perugia, and many other cities, and then after a fortnight passed between Rome and Naples went to the Venetian provinces and visited all those wondrous towns that lie between the southern slopes of the Alps and the northern ones of the Apennines, coming back at last by the S. Gothard. I doubt whether he had enjoyed the trip more than I did myself, but it was not till we were on the point of returning that Ernest had recovered strength enough to be called fairly well, and it was not for many months that he so completely lost all sense of the wounds which the last 4 years had inflicted on him as to feel as though there were a scar, and a scar only remaining. They say that when people have lost an arm or a foot, they feel pains in it now and again, for a long while after they have lost it. One pain which he had almost forgotten came upon him on his return to England. I mean the sting of his having been imprisoned. As long as he was only a small shopkeeper, his imprisonment mattered nothing. Nobody knew of it, and if they had known they would not have cared. Now, however, though he was returning to his old position, he was returning to it disgraced, and the pain from which he had been saved in the first instance by surroundings, so new that he had hardly recognized his own identity in the middle of them, came on him as from a wound inflicted yesterday. He thought of the high resolves which he had made in prison about using his disgrace as a vantage ground of strength rather than trying to make people forget it. That was all very well then, he thought to himself, when the grapes were beyond my reach, but now it is different. Besides, who but a prig would set himself high aims or make high resolves at all? Some of his old friends, on learning that he had got rid of his supposed wife and was now comfortably off again, wanted to renew their acquaintance. He was grateful to them and sometimes tried to meet their advances halfway, but it did not do, and ere long he shrank back into himself, pretending not to know them. An infernal demon of honesty haunted him which made him say to himself, "These men know a great deal, but do not know all. If they did they would cut me, therefore I have no right to their acquaintance." He thought that everyone except himself was sans pour et sans reproche. Of course they must be, for if they had not been, would they not have been bound to warn all who had anything to do with them of their deficiencies? Well, he could not do this, and he would not have people's acquaintance under false pretenses, so he gave up even hankering after rehabilitation, and fell back upon his old tastes for music and literature. Of course he has long since found out how silly all this was, how silly I mean in theory, for in practice it worked better than it ought to have done, by keeping him free from liaisons which would have tied his tongue and made him see success elsewhere than where he came in time to see it. He did what he did instinctively, and for no other reason than because it was most natural to him. So far as he thought at all, he thought wrong, but what he did was right. I said something of this kind to him once not so very long ago, and told him he had always aimed high. "I never aimed at all," he replied a little indignantly, "and you may be sure I should have aimed low enough if I had thought I had got the chance." I suppose after all that no one whose mind was not, to put it mildly, abnormal, ever yet aimed very high out of pure malice aforethought. I once saw a fly alight on a cup of hot coffee on which the milk had formed a thin skin. He perceived his extreme danger, and I noted with what ample strides and almost supermuscan effort he struck across the treacherous surface, and made for the edge of the cup, for the ground was not solid enough to let him raise himself from it by his wings. As I watched him, I fancied that so supreme a moment of difficulty and danger might leave him with an increase of moral and physical power, which might even descend in some measure to his offspring. But surely he would not have got the increased moral power if he could have helped it, and he will not knowingly alight upon another cup of hot coffee. The more I see, the more sure I am that it does not matter why people do the right thing so long only as they do it, nor why they may have done the wrong if they have done it. The result depends upon the thing done, and the motive goes for nothing. I have read somewhere, but cannot remember where, that in some country district there was once a great scarcity of food, during which the poor suffered acutely. Many indeed actually died of starvation, and all were hard put to it. In one village, however, there was a poor widow with a family of young children, who, though she had small visible means of subsistence, still looked well-fed and comfortable, as also did all her little ones. How, everyone asked, did they manage to live? It was plain they had a secret, and it was equally plain that it could be no good one, for there came a hurried, hunted look over the poor woman's face if anyone alluded to the way in which she and hers throve when others starved. The family, moreover, were sometimes seen out at unusual hours of the night, and evidently brought things home, which could hardly have been honestly come by. They knew they were under suspicion, and being hitherto of excellent name, it made them very unhappy, for it must be confessed that they believed what they did to be uncanny if not absolutely wicked. Nevertheless, in spite of this they throve, and kept their strength when all their neighbours were pinched. At length matters came to a head, and the clergyman of the parish cross-questioned the poor woman so closely that with many tears and a bitter sense of degradation she confessed the truth. She and her children went into the hedges and gathered snails, which they made into broth and ate. Could she ever be forgiven? Was there any hope of salvation for her either in this world or the next after such unnatural conduct? So again I have heard of an old dowager countess whose money was all in consols. She had had many sons, and in her anxiety to give the younger ones a good start, wanted a larger income than consols would give her. She consulted her solicitor and was advised to sell her consols and invest in the London and North Western Railway, then at about 85. This was to her what eating snails was to the poor widow whose story I have told above. With shame and grief, as of one doing an unclean thing, but her boys must have their starch, did as she was advised. Then for a long while she could not sleep at night, and was haunted by a presage of disaster. Yet what happened? She started her boys, and in a few years found her capital doubled into the bargain, on which she sold out and went back again to consols and died in the full blessedness of fundholding. She thought indeed that she was doing a wrong and dangerous thing, but this had absolutely nothing to do with it. Suppose she had invested in the full confidence of a recommendation by some eminent London banker whose advice was bad, and so had lost all her money, and suppose she had done this with a light heart, and with no conviction of sin, would her innocence of evil purpose and the excellence of her motive have stood her in any stead? Not they. But to return to my story, Towneley gave my hero most trouble. Towneley, as I have said, knew that Ernest would have money soon, but Ernest did not of course know that he knew it. Towneley was rich himself and was married now. Ernest would be rich soon, had bona fide intended to be married already, and would doubtless marry a lawful wife later on. Such a man was worth taking pains with, and when Towneley one day met Ernest in the street, and Ernest tried to avoid him, Towneley would not have it, but with his usual quick good nature read his thoughts, caught him, morally speaking, by the scruff of his neck, and turned him laughingly inside out, telling him he would have no such nonsense. Towneley was just as much Ernest's idol now as he had ever been, and Ernest, who was very easily touched, felt more gratefully and warmly than ever towards him. But there was an unconscious something which was stronger than Towneley, and made my hero determined to break with him more determinedly perhaps than with any other living person. He thanked him in a low, hurried voice and pressed his hand, while tears came into his eyes in spite of all his efforts to repress them. "If we meet again," he said, "do not look at me, but if hereafter you hear of me writing things you do not like, think of me as charitably as you can," and so they parted. "Towneley is a good fellow," said I gravely, "and you should not have cut him." "Towneley," he answered, "is not only a good fellow, but he is without exception the very best man I ever saw in my life, except he paid me the compliment of saying yourself. Towneley is my notion of everything which I should most like to, but there is no real solidarity between us. I should be in perpetual fear of losing his good opinion if I said things he did not like, and I mean to say a great many things," he continued more merrily, "which Towneley will not like. A man, as I have said already, can give up father and mother for Christ's sake tolerably easily for the most part, but it is not so easy to give up people like Towneley." Chapter 81. So he fell away from all old friends except myself and 3 or 4 old intimates of my own, who were as sure to take to him as he to them, and who like myself enjoyed getting hold of a young fresh mind. Ernest attended to the keeping of my account books whenever there was anything which could possibly be attended to, which there seldom was, and spent the greater part of the rest of his time in adding to the many notes and tentative essays which had already accumulated in his portfolios. Anyone who was used to writing could see at a glance that literature was his natural development, and I was pleased at seeing him settle down to it so spontaneously. I was less pleased, however, to observe that he would still occupy himself with none but the most serious, I had almost said solemn, subjects, just as he never cared about any but the most serious kind of music. I said to him one day that the very slender reward which God had attached to the pursuit of serious inquiry was a sufficient proof that he disapproved of it, or at any rate that he did not set much store by it nor wish to encourage it. He said, "Oh, don't talk about rewards. Look at Milton, who only got 5 for Paradise Lost." And a great deal too much, I rejoined promptly. I would have given him twice as much myself not to have written it at all. Ernest was a little shocked. "At any rate," he said laughingly, "I don't write poetry." This was a cut at me, for my burlesques were of course written in rhyme, so I dropped the matter. After a time he took it into his head to reopen the question of his getting 300 a year for doing, as he said, absolutely nothing, and said he would try to find some employment which should bring him in enough to live upon. I laughed at this but let him alone. He tried and tried very hard for a long while, but I need hardly say was unsuccessful. The older I grow, the more convinced I become of the folly and credulity of the public, but at the same time the harder do I see it is to impose oneself upon that folly and credulity. He tried editor after editor with article after article. Sometimes an editor listened to him and told him to leave his articles. He almost invariably, however, had them returned to him in the end with a polite note saying that they were not suited for the particular paper to which he had sent them. And yet many of these very articles appeared in his later works, and no one complained of them, not at least on the score of bad literary workmanship. "I see," he said to me one day, "that demand is very imperious, and supply must be very suppliant." Once, indeed, the editor of an important monthly magazine accepted an article from him, and he thought he had now got a footing in the literary world. The article was to appear in the next issue but one, and he was to receive proof from the printers in about 10 days or a fortnight. But week after week passed, and there was no proof. Month after month went by, and there was still no room for Ernest's article. At length, after about 6 months, the editor one morning told him that he had filled every number of his review for the next 10 months, but that his article should definitely appear. On this he insisted on having his mise returned to him. Sometimes his articles were actually published, and he found the editor had edited them according to his own fancy, putting in jokes which he thought were funny, or cutting out the very passage which Ernest had considered the point of the whole thing, and then, though the articles appeared, when it came to paying for them it was another matter, and he never saw his money. Editors, he said to me one day about this time, are like the people who bought and sold in the book of Revelation. There is not one but has the mark of the beast upon him. At last, after months of disappointment, and many a tedious hour wasted in dingy anterooms, and of all anterooms those of editors appear to me to be the dreariest, he got a bona fide offer of employment from one of the first-class weekly papers. Through an introduction I was able to get for him from one who had powerful influence with the paper in question. The editor sent him a dozen long books upon varied and difficult subjects, and told him to review them in a single article within a week. In one book there was an editorial note to the effect that the writer was to be condemned. Ernest particularly admired the book he was desired to condemn, and feeling how hopeless it was for him to do anything like justice to the books submitted to him, returned them to the editor. At last one paper did actually take a dozen or so of articles from him, and gave him cash down a couple of guineas apiece for them, but having done this, it expired within a fortnight after the last of Ernest's articles had appeared. It certainly looked very much as if the other editors knew their business in declining to have anything to do with my unlucky godson. I was not sorry that he failed with periodical literature, for writing for reviews or newspapers is bad training for one who may aspire to write works of more permanent interest. A young writer should have more time for reflection than he can get as a contributor to the daily or even weekly press. Ernest himself, however, was chagrined at finding how unmarketable he was. "Why," he said to me, "if I was a well-bred horse or sheep or a pure-bred pigeon or low-paired rabbit, I should be more saleable. If I was even a cathedral in a colonial town, people would give me something, but as it is they do not want me." And now that he was well and rested he wanted to set up a shop again, but this, of course, I would not hear of. "What care I," said he to me one day, "about being what they call a gentleman?" And his manner was almost fierce. "What has being a gentleman ever done for me, except make me less able to pray and more easy to be preyed upon? It has changed the manner of my being swindled, that is all. But for your kindness to me I should be penniless. Thank heaven I have placed my children where I have." I begged him to keep quiet a little longer and not talk about taking a shop. "Well, being a gentleman," he said, bring me money at the last, and will anything bring me as much peace at the last as money will? They say that those who have riches enter hardly into the kingdom of heaven. By Jove, they do. They are like struldbrugs. They live and live and live, and are happy for many a long year after they would have entered into the kingdom of heaven if they had been poor. I want to live long and to raise my children, if I see they would be happier for the raising. That is what I want, and it is not what I am doing now that will help me. Being a gentleman is a luxury which I cannot afford, therefore I do not want it. Let me go back to my shop again, and do things for people which they want done and will pay me for doing for them. They know what they want and what is good for them better than I can tell them. It was hard to deny the soundness of this, and if he had been dependent only on the 300 a year which he was getting from me, I should have advised him to open his shop again next morning. As it was, I temporized and raised obstacles, and quieted him from time to time as best I could. Of course he read Mr. Darwin's books as fast as they came out and adopted evolution as an article of faith. It seems to me, he said once, that I am like one of those caterpillars which, if they have been interrupted in making their hammock, must begin again from the beginning. So long as I went back a long way down in the social scale, I got on all right, and should have made money but for Ellen. When I try to take up the work at a higher stage, I fail completely. I do not know whether the analogy holds good or not, but I am sure Ernest's instinct was right in telling him that after a heavy fall, he had better begin life again at a very low stage, and as I have just said, I would have let him go back to his shop if I had not known what I 999. As the time fixed upon by his aunt drew nearer, I prepared him more and more for what was coming, and at last, on his 28th birthday, I was able to tell him all and to show him the letter signed by his aunt upon her deathbed, to the effect that I was to hold the money in trust for him. His birthday happened that year to be on a Sunday, but on the following day I transferred his shares into his own name, and presented him with the account books which he had been keeping for the last year and a half. In spite of all that I had done to prepare him, it was a long while before I could get him actually to believe that the money was his own. He did not say much no more, did I? For I am not sure that I did not feel as much moved at having brought my long trusteeship to a satisfactory conclusion as Ernest did at finding himself owner of more than 70,000. When he did speak, it was to jerk out a sentence or two of reflection at a time. If I were rendering this moment in music, he said, I should allow myself free use of the augmented sixth. A little later I remember his saying with a laugh that had something of a family likeness to his aunt's, It is not the pleasure it causes me which I enjoy so, it is the pain it will cause to all my friends except yourself and Towneley. I said, You cannot tell your father and mother, it would drive them mad. No, 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 said he, it would be too cruel. It would be like Isaac offering up Abraham and no thicket with a ram in it near at hand. Besides, why should I? We have cut each other these 4 years. Chapter 82. It almost seemed as though our casual mention of Theobald and Christina had in some way excited them from a dormant to an active state. During the years that had elapsed since they last appeared upon the scene, they had remained at Battersby, and had concentrated their affection upon their other children. It had been a bitter pill to Theobald to lose his power of plaguing his firstborn. If the truth were known, I believe, he had felt this more acutely than any disgrace which might have been shed upon him by Ernest's imprisonment. He had made 1 or 2 attempts to reopen negotiations through me, but I never said anything about them to Ernest, for I knew it would upset him. I wrote, however, to Theobald that I had found his son inexorable, and recommended him for the present, at any rate, to desist from returning to the subject. This I thought would be at once what Ernest would like best and Theobald least. A few days, however, after Ernest had come into his property, I received a letter from Theobald enclosing one for Ernest which I could not withhold. The letter ran thus: To my son Ernest, although you have more than once rejected my overtures, I appeal yet again to your better nature. Your mother, who has long been ailing, is, I believe, near her end. She is unable to keep anything on her stomach, and Dr. Martin holds out but little hopes of her recovery. She has expressed a wish to see you, and says she knows you will not refuse to come to her, which, considering her condition, I am unwilling to suppose you will. I remit you a post-office order for your fare, and will pay your return journey. If you want clothes to come in, order what you consider suitable, and desire that the bill be sent to me. I will pay it immediately, to an amount not exceeding £8 or £9, and if you will let me know what train you will come by, I will send the carriage to meet you. Believe me, your affectionate father. T. Pontifex. Of course there could be no hesitation on Ernest's part. He could afford to smile now at his father's offering to pay for his clothes, and his sending him a post-office order for the exact price of a second-class ticket, and he was of course shocked at learning the state his mother was said to be in, and touched at her desire to see him. He telegraphed that he would come down at once. I saw him a little before he started, and was pleased to see how well his tailor had done by him. Towneley himself could not have been appointed more becomingly. His portmanteau, his railway wrapper, everything he had about him, was in keeping. I thought he had grown much better looking than he had been at 2 or 23. His year and a half of peace had effaced all the ill effects of his previous suffering, and now that he had become actually rich there was an air of insouciance and good humour upon his face, as of a man with whom everything was going perfectly right, which would have made a much plainer man good-looking. I was proud of him and delighted with him. I am sure, I said to myself, that whatever else he may do, he will never marry again. The journey was a painful one. As he drew near to the station and caught sight of each familiar feature, so strong was the force of association that he felt as though his coming into his aunt's money had been a dream, and he were again returning to his father's house as he had returned to it from Cambridge for the vacations. Do what he would, the old dull weight of homesickness began to oppress him. His heart beat fast as he thought of his approaching meeting with his father and mother, and I shall have, he said to himself, to kiss Charlotte. Would his father meet him at the station? Would he greet him as though nothing had happened, or would he be cold and distant? How, again, would he take the news of his son's good fortune? As the train drew up to the platform, Ernest's eye ran hurriedly over the few people who were in the station. His father's well-known form was not among them, but on the other side of the palings which divided the station yard from the platform, he saw the pony carriage, looking, as he thought, rather shabby, and recognized his father's coachman. In a few minutes more he was in the carriage driving towards Battersby. He could not help smiling as he saw the coachman give a look of surprise at finding him so much changed in personal appearance. The coachman was the more surprised because when Ernest had last been at home, he had been dressed as a clergyman, and now he was not only a layman, but a layman who was got up regardless of expense. The change was so great that it was not till Ernest actually spoke to him that the coachman knew him. "How are my father and mother?" he asked hurriedly as he got into the carriage. "The master's well, sir," was the answer, "but the missus is very sadly." The horse knew that he was going home and pulled hard at the reins. The weather was cold and wrought very ideal of a November day. In one part of the road the floods were out, and near here they had to pass through a number of horsemen and dogs, for the hounds had met that morning at a place near Battersby. Ernest saw several people whom he knew, but they either, as is most likely, did not recognize him, or did not know of his good luck. When Battersby church tower drew near, and he saw the rectory on the top of the hill, its chimneys just showing above the leafless trees with which it was surrounded, he threw himself back in the carriage and covered his face with his hands. It came to an end, as even the worst quarters of an hour do, and in a few minutes more he was on the steps in front of his father's house. His father, hearing the carriage arrive, came a little way down the steps to meet him. Like the coachman, he saw at a glance that Ernest was appointed as though money were abundant with him, and that he was looking robust and full of health and vigour. This was not what he had bargained for. He wanted Ernest to return, but he was to return as any respectable, well-regulated prodigal ought to return, abject, broken-hearted, asking forgiveness from the tenderest and most long-suffering father in the whole world. If he should have shoes and stockings and whole clothes at all, it should be only because absolute rags and tatters had been graciously dispensed with, whereas here he was swaggering in a grey ulster and a blue and white necktie, and looking better than Theobald had ever seen him in his life. It was unprincipled. Was it for this that he had been generous enough to offer to provide Ernest with decent clothes in which to come and visit his mother's deathbed? Could any advantage be meaner than the one which Ernest had taken? Well, he would not go a penny beyond the £8 or £9 which he had promised. It was fortunate he had given a limit. Why he, Theobald, had never been able to afford such a portmanteau in his life. He was still using an old one which his father had turned over to him when he went up to Cambridge. Besides, he had said clothes, not a portmanteau. Ernest saw what was passing through his father's mind, and felt that he ought to have prepared him in some way for what he now saw, but he had sent his telegram so immediately on receiving his father's letter, and had followed it so promptly that it would not have been easy to do so even if he had thought of it. He put out his hand, and said laughingly, "Oh, it's all paid for. I am afraid you do not know that Mr. Overton has handed over to me Aunt Alethia's money." Theobald flushed scarlet. But why, he said, and these were the first words that actually crossed his lips, if the money was not his to keep, did he not hand it over to my brother John and me? He stammered a good deal and looked sheepish, but he got the words out. "Because, my dear father," said Ernest, still laughing, "my aunt left it to him in trust for me, not in trust either for you or for my Uncle John, and it has accumulated till it is now over 70,000. But tell me, how is my mother?" "No, Ernest," said Theobald excitedly, "the matter cannot rest here. I must know that this is all open and above board." This had the true Theobald ring, and instantly brought the whole train of ideas which in Ernest's mind were connected with his father. The surroundings were the old familiar ones, but the surrounded were changed almost beyond power of recognition. He turned sharply on Theobald in a moment. I will not repeat the words he used, for they came out before he had time to consider them, and they might strike some of my readers as disrespectful. There were not many of them, but they were effectual. Theobald said nothing, but turned almost of an ashen colour. He never again spoke to his son in such a way as to make it necessary for him to repeat what he had said on this occasion. Ernest quickly recovered his temper, and again asked after his mother. Theobald was glad enough to take this opening now, and replied at once in the tone he would have assumed towards one he most particularly desired to conciliate, that she was getting rapidly worse in spite of all he had been able to do for her, and concluded by saying she had been the comfort and mainstay of his life for more than 30 years, but that he could not wish it prolonged. The pair then went upstairs to Christina's room, the one in which Ernest had been born. His father went before him and prepared her for her son's approach. The poor woman raised herself in bed as he came towards her, and weeping as she flung her arms around him, cried, "Oh, I knew he would come, I knew he could come." Ernest broke down and wept as he had not done for years. "Oh, my boy," she said as soon as she could recover her voice, "have you never really been near us for all these years? Ah, you do not know how we have loved you and mourned over you, Papa, just as much as I have. You know he shows his feelings less, but I can never tell you how very, very deeply he has felt for you. Sometimes at night I have thought I have heard footsteps in the garden, and have got quietly out of bed lest I should wake him, and gone to the window to look out, but there has been only dark or the greyness of the morning, and I have gone crying back to bed again. Still, I think you have been near us, though you were too proud to let us know, and now at last I have you in my arms once more, my dearest, dearest boy." How cruel, how infamously unfeeling Ernest thought he had been. "Mother," he said, "forgive me, fault was mine. I ought not to have been so hard. I was wrong, very wrong." The poor blubbering fellow meant what he said, and his heart yearned to his mother as he had never thought that it could yearn again. "But have you never," she continued, "come although it was in the dark and we did not know Ito, let me think that you have not been so cruel as we have thought you. Tell me that you came if only to comfort me and make me happier." Ernest was ready. "I had no money to come with, mother, till just lately." This was an excuse Christina could understand and make allowance for. "Oh, then you would have come, and I will take the will for the deed, and now that I have you safe again, say that you will never, never leave me, not till, oh my boy, have they told you I am dying?" She wept bitterly and buried her head in her pillow. Chapter 83. Joey and Charlotte were in the room. Joey was now ordained and was curate to Theobald. He and Ernest had never been sympathetic, and Ernest saw at a glance that there was no chance of a rapprochement between them. He was a little startled at seeing Joey dressed as a clergyman, and looking so like what he had looked himself a few years earlier, for there was a good deal of family likeness between the pair, but Joey's face was cold and was illumined with no spark of bohemianism. He was a clergyman and was going to do as other clergymen did, neither better nor worse. He greeted Ernest rather de haut en bas, that is to say, he began by trying to do so, but the affair tailed off unsatisfactorily. His sister presented her cheek to him to be kissed. How he hated it! He had been dreading it for the last 3 hours. She, too, was distant and reproachful in her manner, as such a superior person was sure to be. She had a grievance against him inasmuch as she was still unmarried. She laid the blame of this at Ernest's door. It was his misconduct, she maintained in secret, which had prevented young men from making offers to her, and she ran him up a heavy bill for consequential damages. She and Joey had from the first developed an instinct for hunting with the hounds, and now these two had fairly identified themselves with the older generation that, is to say as against Ernest. On this head there was an offensive and defensive alliance between them, but between themselves there was subdued but internecine warfare. This at least was what Ernest gathered, partly from his recollections of the parties concerned, and partly from his observation of their little ways during the first half-hour after his arrival, while they were all together in his mother's bedroom, for, as yet of course they did not know that he had money. He could see that they eyed him from time to time with a surprise not unmixed with indignation, and knew very well what they were thinking. Christina saw the change which had come over him, how much firmer and more vigorous both in mind and body he seemed than when she had last seen him. She saw too how well he was dressed, and like the others, in spite of the return of all her affection for her firstborn, was a little alarmed about Theobald's pocket, which she supposed would have to be mulcted for all this magnificence. Perceiving this, Ernest relieved her mind and told her all about his aunt's bequest, and how I had husbanded it in the presence of his brother and sister who, however, pretended not to notice, or at any rate to notice as a matter in which they could hardly be expected to take an interest. His mother kicked a little at first against the money's having gone to him, as she said over his papa's head. "Why, my dear," she said in a deprecating tone, "this is more than ever your papa has had." But Ernest calmed her by suggesting that if Miss Pontifex had known how large the sum would become she would have left the greater part of it to Theobald. This compromise was accepted by Christina, who forthwith, ill as she was, entered with ardour into the new position, and taking it as a fresh point of departure, began spending Ernest's money for him. I may say in passing that Christina was right in saying that Theobald had never had so much money as his son was now possessed of. In the first place, he had not had a 14 years' minority with no outgoings to prevent the accumulation of the money, and in the second he, like myself and almost everyone else, had suffered somewhat in the 1846 times, not enough to cripple him or even seriously to hurt him, but enough to give him a scare and make him stick to debentures for the rest of his life. It was the fact of his son's being the richer man of the two, and of his being rich so young, which rankled with Theobald even more than the fact of his having money at all. If he had had to wait till he was 60 or 65, and become broken down from long failure in the meantime, why then perhaps he might have been allowed to have whatever sum should suffice to keep him out of the workhouse and pay his deathbed expenses, but that he should come into 70,000 at 28 and have no wife and only 2 children, it was intolerable. Christina was too ill and in too great a hurry to spend the money to care much about such details as the foregoing, and she was naturally much more good-natured than Theobald. This piece of good fortune saw it at a glance, quite wiped out the disgrace of his having been imprisoned. There should be no more nonsense about that. The whole thing was a mistake, an unfortunate mistake, true, but the less said about it now the better. Of course Ernest would come back and live at Battersby until he was married, and he would pay his father handsomely for board and lodging. In fact, it would be only right that Theobald should make a profit, nor would Ernest himself wish it to be other than a handsome one. This was far the best and simplest arrangement, and he could take his sister out more than Theobald or Joey cared to do, and would also doubtless entertain very handsomely at Battersby. Of course he would buy Joey a living, and make large presents yearly to his sister. Was there anything else? Oh, yes, would become a county magnate now. A man with nearly 4,000 a year should certainly become a county magnate. He might even go into Parliament. He had very fair abilities, nothing indeed approaching such genius as Dr. Skinner's, nor even as Theobald's. Still he was not deficient, and if he got into Parliament, so young Tuther was nothing to hinder his being Prime Minister before he died, and if so, of course he would become a peer. Oh, why did he not set about it all at once, so that she might live to hear people call her son my Lord Battersby? She thought would do very nicely, and if she was well enough to sit, he must certainly have her portrait painted at full length for one end of his large dining hall. It should be exhibited at the Royal Academy. Portrait of Lord Battersby's mother, she said to herself, and her heart fluttered with all its wonted vivacity. If she could not sit, happily, she had been photographed not so very long ago, and the portrait had been as successful as any photograph could be of a face which depended so entirely upon its expression as her own. Perhaps the painter could take the portrait sufficiently from this. It was better, after all, that Ernest had given up the church. How far more wisely God arranges matters for us than ever we can do for ourselves. She saw it all. No, it was Joey who would become Archbishop of Canterbury, and Ernest would remain a layman and become Prime Minister. and so on till her daughter told her it was time to take her medicine. I suppose this reverie, which is a mere fragment of what actually ran through Christina's brain, occupied about a minute and a half, but it or the presence of her son seemed to revive her spirits wonderfully. Ill, dying indeed, and suffering as she was, she brightened up so as to laugh once or twice quite merrily during the course of the afternoon. Next day Dr. Martin said she was so much better that he almost began to have hopes of her recovery again. Theobald, whenever this was touched upon as possible, would shake his head and say, "We can't wish it prolonged," and then Charlotte caught Ernest unawares and said, "You know, dear Ernest, that these ups and downs of talk are terribly agitating to Papa. He could stand whatever comes, but it is quite too wearing to him to think half a dozen different things backwards and forwards, up and down in the same 24 hours, and it would be kinder of you not to do it. I mean not to say anything to him, even though Dr. Martin does hold out hopes." Charlotte had meant to imply that it was Ernest who was at the bottom of all the inconvenience felt by Theobald, herself, Joey, and everyone else, and she had actually got words out which should convey this. True, she had not dared to stick to them and had turned them off, but she had made them hers at any rate for one brief moment, and this was better than nothing. Ernest noticed throughout his mother's illness that Charlotte found immediate occasion to make herself disagreeable to him whenever either doctor or nurse pronounced her mother to be a little better. When she wrote to Crampsford to desire the prayers of the congregation, she was sure her mother would wish it, and that the Crampsford people would be pleased at her remembrance of them. She was sending another letter on some quite different subject at the same time, and put the two letters into the wrong envelopes. Ernest was asked to take these letters to the village post office, and imprudently did so. When the error came to be discovered, Christina happened to have rallied a little. Charlotte flew at Ernest immediately, and laid all the blame of the blunder upon his shoulders. Except that Joey and Charlotte were more fully developed, the house and its inmates, organic and inorganic, were little changed since Ernest had last seen them. The furniture and the ornaments on the chimney-piece were just as they had been ever since he could remember anything at all. In the drawing-room, on either side of the fireplace, there hung the Carlo Dalsi and the Sassoferrato as in old times. There was the water-colour of a scene on the Lego Magia, copied by Charlotte from an original lent her by her drawing master, and finished under his direction. This was the picture of which one of the servants had said that it must be good, for Mr. Pontifex had given 10 shillings for the frame. The paper on the walls was unchanged, the roses were still waiting for the bees, and the whole family still prayed night and morning to be made truly honest and conscientious. One picture only was removed, a photograph of himself, which had hung under one of his father and between those of his brother and sister. Ernest noticed this at prayer time, while his father was reading about Noah's Ark and how they daubed it with slime, which, as it happened, had been Ernest's favourite text when he was a boy. Next morning, however, the photograph had found its way back again, a little dusty, and with a bit of the gilding chipped off from one corner of the frame, but there sure enough it was. I suppose they put it back when they found how rich he had become. In the dining-room the ravens were still trying to feed Elijah over the fireplace. What a crowd of reminiscences did not this picture bring back! Looking out of the window, there were the flower beds in the front garden exactly as they had been, and Ernest found himself looking hard against the blue door at the bottom of the garden to see if there was rain falling, as he had been used to look when he was a child doing lessons with his father. After their early dinner, when Joey and Ernest and their father were left alone, Theobald rose and stood in the middle of the hearthrug under the Elijah picture and began to whistle in his old absent way. He had 2 tunes only, one was In My Cottage Near a Wood and the other was the Easter hymn. He had been trying to whistle them all his life but had never succeeded. He whistled them as a clever bullfinch might whistle them Hare had got them, but he had not got them right. He would be a semitone out in every third note as though reverting to some remote musical progenitor who had known none. But the Lydian or the Phrygian mode, or whatever would enable him to go most wrong while still keeping the tune near enough to be recognized. Theobald stood before the middle of the fire and whistled his 2 tunes softly in his own old way, till Ernest left the room. The unchangedness of the external and changedness of the internal, he felt, were likely to throw him completely off his balance. He strolled out of doors into the sodden spinney behind the house, and solaced himself with a pipe. Ere long he found himself at the door of the cottage of his father's coachman, who had married an old lady's maid of his mother's, to whom Ernest had been always much attached as she also to him, for she had known him ever since he had been 5 or 6 years old. Her name was Susan. He sat down in the rocking chair before her fire, and Susan went on ironing at the table in front of the window, and a smell of hot flannel pervaded the kitchen. Susan had been retained too securely by Christina to be likely to side with Ernest all in a moment. He knew this very well, and did not call on her for the sake of support, moral or otherwise. He had called because he liked her, and also because he knew that he should gather much in a chat with her that he should not be able to arrive at in any other way. "Oh, Master Ernest," said Susan, "why did you not come back when your poor papa and mamma wanted you? I am sure your ma has said to me 100 times over, if she has said it once, that all should be exactly as it had been before." Ernest smiled to himself. It was no use explaining to Susan why he smiled, so he said nothing. "For the first day or two I thought she never would get over it. She said it was a judgment upon her, and went on about things as she had said and done many years ago before your pa knew her, and I don't know what she didn't say or wouldn't have said, only I stopped her. She seemed out of her mind like, and said that none of the neighbours would ever speak to her again, but the next day Mrs. Bushby her. That was Miss Cowie, you know, called, and your ma always was so fond of her, and it seemed to do her a power o' good, for the next day she went through all her dresses, and we settled how she should have them altered. And then all the neighbours called for miles and miles round, and your ma came in here, and said she had been going through the waters of misery, and the Lord had turned them to a well. "Oh yes, Susan," said she, "be sure it is so. Whom the Lord loveth he chasteneth, Susan," and here she began to cry again. "As for him," she went on, "he has made his bed, and he must lie on it. When he comes out of prison his pa will know what is best to be done, and Master Ernest may be thankful that he has a pa so good and so long-suffering. Then when you would not see them, that was a cruel blow to your ma. Your pa did not say anything. You know your pa never does say very much unless he's downright waxy for the time, but your ma took on dreadful for a few days, and I never saw the master look so black. But bless you, it all went off in a few days, and I don't know that there's been much difference in either of them since then, not till your ma was took 99. On the night of his arrival he had behaved well at family prayers, as also on the following morning. His father read about David's dying injunctions to Solomon in the matter of Shimei, but he did not mind it. In the course of the day, however, his corns had been trodden on so many times that he was in a misbehaving humour, on this the second night after his arrival. He knelt next Charlotte, and said the responses perfunctorily, not so perfunctorily that she should know for certain that he was doing it maliciously, but so perfunctorily as to make her uncertain whether he might be malicious or not, and when he had to pray to be made truly honest and conscientious, he emphasized the truly. I do not know whether Charlotte noticed anything, but she knelt at some distance from him during the rest of his stay. He assures me that this was the only spiteful thing he did during the whole time he was at Battersby. When he went up to his bedroom, in which, to do them justice, they had given him a fire, he noticed what indeed he had noticed as soon as he was shown into it on his arrival, that there was an illuminated card framed and glazed over his bed with the words, "Be the day weary or be the day long, at last it ringeth to evensong." He wondered to himself how such people could leave such a card in a room in which their visitors would have to spend the last hours of their evening, but he let it alone. "There's not enough difference between weary and long to warrant an or," he said, "but I suppose it is all right." I believe Christina had bought the card at a bazaar in aid of the restoration of a neighbouring church, and having been bought it had got to be used besides. The sentiment was so touching, and the illumination was really lovely. Anyhow, no irony could be more complete than leaving it in my hero's bedroom, though assuredly no irony had been intended. On the third day after Ernest's arrival Christina relapsed again. For the last 2 days she had been in no pain, and had slept a good deal. Her son's presence still seemed to cheer her, and she often said how thankful she was to be surrounded on her deathbed by a family so happy, so God-fearing, so united. But now she began to wander, and being more sensible of the approach of death, seemed also more alarmed at the thoughts of the day of judgment. She ventured more than once or twice to return to the subject of her sins, and implored Theobald to make quite sure that they were forgiven her. She hinted that she considered his professional reputation was at stake. It would never do for his own wife to fail in securing at any rate a pass. This was touching Theobald on a tender spot. He winced and rejoined with an impatient toss of the head, "But, Christina, they are forgiven you," and then he entrenched himself in a firm but dignified manner behind the Lord's Prayer. When he rose, he left the room, but called Ernest out to say that he could not wish it prolonged. Joey was no more use in quieting his mother's anxiety than Theobald had been. Indeed, he was only Theobald and water. At last Ernest, who had not liked interfering, took the matter in hand, and, sitting beside her, let her pour out her grief to him without let or hindrance. She said she knew she had not given up all for Christ's sake. It was this that weighed upon her. She had given up much, and had always tried to give up more year by year. Still she knew very well that she had not been so spiritually minded as she ought to have been. If she had, she should probably have been favored with some direct vision or communication, whereas, though God had vouchsafed such direct and visible angelic visits to one of her dear children, yet she had had none such herself, nor even had Theobald. She was talking rather to herself than to Ernest as she said these words, but they made him open his ears. He wanted to know whether the angel had appeared to Joey or to Charlotte. He asked his mother, but she seemed surprised, as though she expected him to know all about it. Then, as if she remembered, she checked herself and said, "Ah, yes, you know nothing of all this, and perhaps it is as well." Ernest could not, of course, press the subject, so he never found out which of his near relations it was who had had direct communication with an immortal. The others never said anything to him about it, though whether this was because they were ashamed, or because they feared he would not believe the story and thus increase his own damnation, he could not determine. Ernest has often thought about this since. He tried to get the facts out of Susan, who he was sure would know, but Charlotte had been beforehand with him. "No, Master Ernest," said Susan, when he began to question her, "your ma has sent a message to me by Miss Charlotte as I am not to say nothing at all about it, and I never will." Of course no further questioning was possible. It had more than once occurred to Ernest that Charlotte did not in reality believe more than he did himself, and this incident went far to strengthen his surmises, but he wavered when he remembered how she had misdirected the letter asking for the prayers of the congregation. "I suppose," he said to himself gloomily, "she does believe in it after all." Then Christina returned to the subject of her own want of spiritual mindedness. She even hopped upon the old grievance of her having eaten black pudding strew. She had given them up years ago, but for how many years had she not persevered in eating them, after she had had misgivings about their having been forbidden? Then there was something that weighed on her mind that had taken place before her marriage, and she should like. Ernest interrupted. "My dear mother," he said, "you are ill and your mind is unstrung. Others can now judge better about you than you can. I assure you that to me you seem to have been the most devotedly unselfish wife and mother that ever lived. Even if you have not literally given up all for Christ's sake, you have done so practically as far as it was in your power, and more than this is not required of anyone. I believe you will not only be a saint, but a very distinguished one." At these words Christina brightened. "You give me hope, you give me hope," she cried and dried her eyes. She made him assure her over and over again that this was his solemn conviction. She did not care about being a distinguished saint now. She would be quite content to be among the meanest who actually got into heaven, provided she could make sure of escaping that awful hell. The fear of this evidently was omnipresent with her, and in spite of all Ernest could say, he did not quite dispel it. She was rather ungrateful, I must confess, for after more than an hour's consolation from Ernest, she prayed for him that he might have every blessing in this world, inasmuch as she always feared that he was the only one of her children whom she should never meet in heaven. But she was then wandering, and was hardly aware of his presence. Her mind, in fact, was reverting to states in which it had been before her illness. On Sunday Ernest went to church as a matter of course, and noted that the ever-receding tide of evangelicalism had ebbed many a stage lower, even during the few years of his absence. His father used to walk to the church through the rectory garden and across a small intervening field. He had been used to walk in a tall hat, his master's gown, and wearing a pair of Geneva bands. Ernest noticed that the bands were worn no longer, and lo, greater marvel still, Theobald did not preach in his master's gown, but in a surplice. The whole character of the service was changed. You could not say it was high even now, for High Church Theobald could never under any circumstances become, but the old easy-going slovenliness, if I may say so, was gone forever. The orchestral accompaniments to the hymns had disappeared while my hero was yet a boy, but there had been no chanting for some years after the harmonium had been introduced. While Ernest was at Cambridge, Charlotte and Christina had prevailed on Theobald to allow the canticles to be sung, and sung they were to old-fashioned double chants by Lord Mornington and Dr. Dupuy and others. Theobald did not like it, but he did it, or allowed it to be done. Then Christina said, "My dear, do you know, I really think Christina always really thought that the people like the chanting very much, and that it will be a means of bringing many to church who have stayed away hitherto. I was talking about it to Mrs. Goodhue and to old Miss Wright only yesterday, and they quite agreed with me, but they all said that we ought to chant the Glory be to the Father at the end of each of the psalms instead of saying it." Theobald looked black, felt the waters of chanting rising higher and higher upon him inch by inch, but he felt also, he knew not why, that he had better yield than fight. So he ordered the Glory be to the Father to be chanted in future, but he did not like it. "Really, Mamma dear," said Charlotte, "when the battle was won, you should not call it the Glory be to the Father, you should say Gloria." "Of course, my dear," said Christina, and she said Gloria for ever after. Then she thought what a wonderfully clever girl Charlotte was, and how she ought to marry no one lower than a bishop. By and by, when Theobald went away for an unusually long holiday one summer, he could find no one but a rather high-church clergyman to take his duty. This gentleman was a man of weight in the neighbourhood, having considerable private means, but without preferment. In the summer he would often help his brother clergymen, and it was through his being willing to take the duty at Battersby for a few Sundays that Theobald had been able to get away for so long. On his return, however, he found that the whole psalms were being chanted as well as the Glorias. The influential clergyman, Christina and Charlotte, took the bull by the horns as soon as Theobald returned, and laughed it all off, and the clergyman laughed and bounced, and Christina laughed and coaxed, and Charlotte uttered unexceptionable sentiments, and the thing was done now and could not be undone, and it was no use grieving over spilt milk. So henceforth the psalms were to be chanted, but Theobald gristled over it in his heart, and he did not like it. During this same absence, what had Mrs. Goodhue and old Miss Wright taken to doing but turning towards the east while repeating the belief? Theobald disliked this even worse than chanting. When he said something about it in a timid way at dinner after service, Charlotte said, "Really, Papa dear, you must take to calling it the creed and not the belief," and Theobald winced impatiently and snorted meek defiance, but the spirit of her aunts Jane and Eliza was strong in Charlotte, and the thing was too small to fight about, and he turned it off with a laugh. As for Charlotte, thought Christina, I believe she knows everything. So Mrs. Goodhue and old Miss Wright continued to turn to the east during the time the creed was said, and by and by others followed their example, and ere long the few who had stood out yielded and turned eastward too. And then Theobald made as though he had thought it all very right and proper from the first, but like it he did not. By and by Charlotte tried to make him say Alleluia instead of Hallelujah, but this was going too far, and Theobald turned, and she got frightened and ran away. And they changed the double chants for single ones, and altered them psalm by psalm, and in the middle of psalms, just where a cursory reader would see no reason why they should do so, they changed from major to minor and from minor back to major. And then they got hymns ancient and modern, and, as I have said, they robbed him of his beloved bands, and they made him preach in a surplice, and he must have celebration of the Holy Communion once a month instead of only 5 times in the year as heretofore, and he struggled in vain against the unseen influence which he felt to be working in season and out of season against all that he had been accustomed to consider most distinctive of his party. Where it was or what it was, he knew not, nor exactly what it would do next, but he knew exceedingly well that go where he would it was undermining him, that it was too persistent for him, that Christina and Charlotte liked it a great deal better than he did, and that it could end in nothing but Rome. Easter decorations indeed, Christmas decorations in reason were proper enough, but Easter decorations, well, it might last his time. This was the course things had taken in the Church of England during the last 40 years. The set has been steadily in one direction. A few men who knew what they wanted made cat's paws of the Christmas and the Charlottes, and the Christmas and the Charlottes made cat's paws of the Mrs. Goodhues and the old Miss Wrights, and Mrs. Goodhues and old Miss Wrights told the Mr. Goodhues and young Miss Wrights what they should do, and when the Mr. Goodhues and the young Miss Wrights did it, the little Goodhues and the rest of the spiritual flock did as they did, and the Theobalds went for nothing. Step by step, day by day, year by year, parish by parish, diocese by diocese, this was how it was done. And yet the Church of England looks with no friendly eyes upon the theory of evolution or descent with modification. My hero thought over these things, and remembered many a ruse on the part of Christina and Charlotte, and many a detail of the struggle which I cannot further interrupt my story to refer to, and he remembered his father's favourite retort that it could only end in Rome. When he was a boy he had firmly believed this, but he smiled now as he thought of another alternative clear enough to himself, but so horrible that it had not even occurred to Theobald, I mean the toppling over of the whole system. At that time, he welcomed the hope that the absurdities and unrealities of the Church would end in her downfall. Since then he has come to think very differently, not as believing in the cow jumping over the moon more than he used to, or more, probably, than 9/10 of the clergy themselves who know as well as he does that their outward and visible symbols are out of date, but because he knows the baffling complexity of the problem when it comes to deciding what is actually to be done. Also, now that he has seen them more closely, he knows better the nature of those wolves in sheep's clothing, who are thirsting for the blood of their victim, and exulting so clamorously over its anticipated early fall into their clutches. The spirit behind the Church is true, though her letter-true auntsie's now true no longer. The spirit behind the high priests of science is as lying as its letter. The Theobalds, who do what they do because it seems to be the correct thing, but who in their hearts neither like it nor believe in it, are in reality the least dangerous of all classes to the peace and liberties of mankind. The man to fear is he who goes at things with the cocksureness of pushing vulgarity and self-conceit. These are not vices which can be justly laid to the charge of the English clergy. Many of the farmers came up to Ernest when service was over and shook hands with him. He found everyone knew of his having come into a fortune. The fact was that Theobald had immediately told 2 or 3 of the greatest gossips in the village, and the story was not long in spreading. It simplified matters, he had said to himself, a good deal. Ernest was civil to Mrs. Goodhue for her husband's sake, but he gave Miss Wright the cut direct, for he knew that she was only Charlotte in disguise. A week passed slowly away. 2 or 3 times the family took the sacrament together round Christina's deathbed. Theobald's impatience became more and more transparent daily, but fortunately Christina, who even if she had been well would have been ready to shut her eyes to it, became weaker and less coherent in mind also, so that she hardly, if at all, perceived it. After Ernest had been in the house about a week, his mother fell into a comatose state, which lasted a couple of days, and in the end went away so peacefully that it was like the blending of sea and sky in mid-ocean, upon a soft, hazy day, when none can say where the earth ends and the heavens begin. Indeed, she died to the realities of life, with less pain than she had waked from many of its illusions. She has been the comfort and mainstay of my life for more than 30 years, said Theobald as soon as all was over, but one could not wish it prolonged, and he buried his face in his handkerchief to conceal his want of emotion. Ernest came back to town the day after his mother's death, and returned to the funeral accompanied by myself. He wanted me to see his father in order to prevent any possible misapprehension about Miss Pontifex's intentions, and I was such an old friend of the family that my presence at Christina's funeral would surprise no one. With all her faults, I had always rather liked Christina. She would have chopped Ernest or anyone else into little pieces of mincemeat to gratify the slightest wish of her husband, but she would not have chopped him up for anyone else, and so long as he did not cross her, she was very fond of him. By nature she was of an even temper, more willing to be pleased than ruffled, very ready to do a good-natured action, provided it did not cost her much exertion, nor involve expense to Theobald. Her own little purse did not matter. Anyone might have as much of that as he or she could get, after she had reserved what was absolutely necessary for her dress. I could not hear of her end as Ernest described it to me without feeling very compassionate towards her. Indeed, her own son could hardly have felt more so. I at once, therefore, consented to go down to the funeral. Perhaps I was also influenced by a desire to see Charlotte and Joey, in whom I felt interested on hearing what my godson had told me. I found Theobald looking remarkably well. Every one said he was bearing it so beautifully. He did indeed once or twice shake his head, and say that his wife had been the comfort and mainstay of his life for over 30 years, but there the matter ended. I stayed over the next day, which was Sunday, and took my departure on the following morning after having told Theobald all that his son wished me to tell him. Theobald asked me to help him with Christina's epitaph. I would say, said he, as little as possible. Eulogies of the departed are in most cases both unnecessary and untrue. Christina's epitaph shall contain nothing which shall be either the one or the other. I should give her name, the dates of her birth and death, and of course say she was my wife, and then I think I should wind up with a simple text, their favourite one, for example. None indeed could be more appropriate. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I said I thought this would be very nice, and it was settled. So Ernest was sent to give the order to Mr. Prosser, the stonemason in the nearest town, who said it came from the Beatitudes. Chapter 84. On our way to town, Ernest broached his plans for spending the next year or two. I wanted him to try and get more into society again, but he brushed this aside at once as the very last thing he had a fancy for. For society indeed of all sorts, except of course that of a few intimate friends, he had an unconquerable aversion. I always did hate those people, he said, and they always have hated and always will hate me. I am an Ishmael by instinct as much as by accident of circumstances, but if I keep out of society I shall be less vulnerable than Ishmaels generally are. The moment a man goes into society, he becomes vulnerable all round. I was very sorry to hear him talk in this way, for whatever strength a man may have he should surely be able to make more of it if he act in concert than alone. I said this. I don't care, he answered, whether I make the most of my strength or not. I don't know whether I have any strength, but if I have I dare say it will find some way of exerting itself. I will live as I like living, not as other people would like me to live. Thanks to my aunt and you I can afford the luxury of a quiet, unobtrusive life of self-indulgence, said he laughing, and I mean to have it. You know I like writing, he added after a pause of some minutes. I have been a scribbler for years. If I am to come to the fore at all, it must be by writing. I had already long since come to that conclusion myself. Well, he continued, there are a lot of things that want saying which no one dares to say, a lot of shams which want attacking, and yet no one attacks them. It seems to me that I can say things which not another man in England except myself will venture to say, and yet which are crying to be said. I said, but who will listen? If you say things which nobody else would dare to say, is not this much the same as saying what everyone, except yourself, knows to be better left unsaid just now? Perhaps, said he, but I don't know it. I am bursting with these things, and it is my fate to say them. I knew there would be no stopping him, so I gave in and asked what question he felt a special desire to burn his fingers with in the first instance. Marriage, he rejoined promptly, and the power of disposing of his property after a man is dead. The question of Christianity is virtually settled, or if not settled there is no lack of those engaged in settling it. The question of the day now is marriage and the family system. That, said I dryly, is a hornet's nest indeed. Yes, said he no less dryly, but hornets' nests are exactly what I happen to like. Before, however, I begin to stir up this particular one I propose to travel for a few years, with the especial object of finding out what nations now existing are the best, comeliest and most lovable, and also what nations have been so in times past. I want to find out how these people live and have lived, and what their customs are. I have very vague notions upon the subject as yet, but the general impression I have formed is that, putting ourselves on one side, the most vigorous and amiable of known nations are the modern Italians, the old Greeks and Romans, and the South Sea Islanders. I believe that these nice peoples have not as a general rule been purists, but I want to see those of them who can yet be seen. They are the practical authorities on the question what is best for man, and I should like to see them and find out what they do. Let us settle the fact first and fight about the moral tendencies afterwards. In fact, said I laughingly, you mean to have high old times. Neither higher nor lower was the answer than those people whom I can find to have been the best in all ages, but let us change the subject. He put his hand into his pocket and brought out a letter. My father, he said, gave me this letter this morning with the seal already broken. He passed it over to me, and I found it to be the one which Christina had written before the birth of her last child, and which I have given in an earlier chapter. And you do not find this letter, said I, affect the conclusion which you have just told me you have come to concerning your present plans? He smiled and answered, No, but if you do what you have sometimes talked about and turn the adventures of my unworthy self into a novel, mind you print this letter. Why so? Said I, feeling as though such a letter as this should have been held sacred from the public gaze. Because my mother would have wished it published. If she had known you were writing about me and had this letter in your possession, she would above all things have desired that you should publish it. Therefore publish it if you write at all. This is why I have done so. Within a month Ernest carried his intention into effect, and having made all the arrangements necessary for his children's welfare, left England before Christmas. I heard from him now and again, and learnt that he was visiting almost all parts of the world, but only staying in those places where he found the inhabitants unusually good-looking and agreeable. He said he had filled an immense quantity of notebooks, and I have no doubt he had. At last in the spring of 1867 he returned, his luggage stained with the variation of each hotel advertisement twixt here and Japan. He looked very brown and strong, and so well favoured that it almost seemed as if he must have caught some good looks from the people among whom he had been living. He came back to his old rooms in the temple, and settled down as easily as if he had never been away a day. One of the first things we did was to go and see the children. We took the train to Gravesend, and walked thence for a few miles along the riverside, till we came to the solitary house where the good people lived with whom Ernest had placed them. It was a lovely April morning, but with a fresh air blowing from off the sea. The tide was high, and the river was alive with shipping coming up with wind and tide. Seagulls wheeled around us overhead. Seaweed clung everywhere to the banks which the advancing tide had not yet covered. Everything was of the sea, and the fine bracing air which blew over the water made me feel more hungry than I had done for many a day. I did not see how children could live in a better physical atmosphere than this, and applauded the selection which Ernest had made on behalf of his youngsters. While we were still a quarter of a mile off, we heard shouts and children's laughter, and could see a lot of boys and girls romping together and running after one another. We could not distinguish our own two, but when we got near they were soon made out, for the other children were blue-eyed, flaxen-pated little folks, whereas ours were dark and straight-haired. We had written to say that we were coming, but had desired that nothing should be said to the children, so these paid no more attention to us than they would have done to any other stranger, who happened to visit a spot so unfrequented except by seafaring folk, which we plainly were not. The interest, however, in us was much quickened when it was discovered that we had got our pockets full of oranges and sweeties, to an extent greater than it had entered into their small imaginations to conceive as possible. At first we had great difficulty in making them come near us. They were like a lot of wild young colts, very inquisitive, but very coy and not to be cajoled easily. The children were 9 in all, 5 boys and 2 girls belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Rowlings, and 2 to Ernest. I never saw a finer lot of children than the young Rowlings. The boys were hardy, robust, fearless little fellows with eyes as clear as hawks. The elder girl was exquisitely pretty, but the younger one was a mere baby. I felt as I looked at them that if I had had children of my own I could have wished no better home for them, nor better companions. Georgie and Alice, Ernest's 2 children, were evidently quite as one family with the others, and called Mr. and Mrs. Rowling's uncle and aunt. They had been so young when they were first brought to the house that they had been looked upon in the light of new babies who had been born into the family. They knew nothing about Mr. and Mrs. Rowling's being paid so much a week to look after them. Ernest asked them all what they wanted to be. They had only one idea. One and all, Georgie among the rest, wanted to be bargemen. Young ducks could hardly have a more evident hankering after the water. "And what do you want, Alice?" said Ernest. "Oh," she said, "I am going to marry Jack here and be a bargeman's wife." Jack was the eldest boy, now nearly 12, a sturdy little fellow, the image of what Mr. Rowlings must have been at his age. As we looked at him, so straight and well grown and well done all round, I could see it was in Ernest's mind as much as in mine that she could hardly do much better. "Come here, Jack, my boy," said Ernest, "here's a shilling for you." The boy blushed and could hardly be got to come in spite of our previous blandishments. He had had pennies given him before, but shillings never. His father caught him good-naturedly by the ear and lugged him to us. "He's a good boy, Jack is," said Ernest to Mr. Rowlings, "I am sure of that." "Yes," said Mr. Rowlings, "he's a very good boy, only that I can't get him to learn his reading and writing. He don't like going to school, that's the only complaint I have against him. I don't know what's the matter with all my children, and yours, Mr. Pontifex, is just as bad, but they none of 'em likes book learning, though they learn anything else fast enough. Why, as for Jack here, he's almost as good a bargeman as I am," and he looked fondly and patronizingly towards his offspring. "I think," said Ernest to Mr. Rowlings, "if he wants to marry Alice when he gets older he had better do so, and he shall have as many barges as he likes. In the meantime, Mr. Rowlings, say in what way money can be of use to you, and whatever you can make useful is at your disposal." I need hardly say that Ernest made matters easy for this good couple. One stipulation, however, he insisted on, namely, there was to be no more smuggling, and that the young people were to be kept out of this, for a little bird had told Ernest that smuggling in a quiet way was one of the resources of the Rawlings family. Mr. Rawlings was not sorry to assent to this, and I believe it is now many years since the Coast Guard people have suspected any of the Rawlings family as offenders against the revenue law. "Why should I take them from where they are," said Ernest to me in the train as we went home, "to send them to schools where they will not be one half so happy, and where their illegitimacy will very likely be a worry to them? Georgie wants to be a bargeman, let him begin as one, the sooner the better. He may as well begin with this as with anything else. Then if he shows developments I can be on the lookout to encourage them and make things easy for him, while if he shows no desire to go ahead, what on earth is the good of trying to shove him forward?" Ernest, I believe, went on with a homily upon education generally, and upon the way in which young people should go through the embryonic stages with their money as much as with their limbs, beginning life in a much lower social position than that in which their parents were, and a lot more which he has since published. But I was getting on in years, and the walk and the bracing air had made me sleepy, so ere we had got past Greenhithe station on our return journey I had sunk into a refreshing sleep. Chapter 85. Ernest, being about 32 years old and having had his fling for the last 3 or 4 years, now settled down in London and began to write steadily. Up to this time he had given abundant promise, but had produced nothing, nor indeed did he come before the public for another 3 or 4 years yet. He lived, as I have said, very quietly, seeing hardly anyone but myself and the 3 or 4 old friends with whom I had been intimate for years. Ernest and we formed our little set, and outside of this my godson was hardly known at all. His main expense was travelling, which he indulged in at frequent intervals, but for short times only. Do what he would he could not get through more than about 1,500 a year. The rest of his income he gave away if he happened to find a case where he thought money would be well bestowed, or put by until some opportunity arose of getting rid of it with advantage. I knew he was writing, but we had had so many little differences of opinion upon this head that by a tacit understanding the subject was seldom referred to between us, and I did not know that he was actually publishing till one day he brought me a book, and told me flat it was his own. I opened it and found it to be a series of semi-theological, semi-social essays, purporting to have been written by 6 or 7 different people, and viewing the same class of subjects from different standpoints. People had not yet forgotten the famous essays and reviews, and Ernest had wickedly given a few touches to at least 2 of the essays, which suggested vaguely that they had been written by a bishop. The essays were all of them in support of the Church of England, and appeared both by internal suggestion and their prima facie purport to be the work of some half-dozen men of experience and high position who had determined to face the difficult questions of the day no less boldly from within the bosom of the Church than the Church's enemies had faced them from without her pale. There was an essay on the external evidences of the resurrection, another on the marriage laws of the most eminent nations of the world in times past and present. Another was devoted to a consideration of the many questions which must be reopened and reconsidered on their merits if the teaching of the Church of England were to cease to carry moral authority with it. Another dealt with the more purely social subject of middle-class destitution. Another with the authenticity, or rather the unauthenticity of the 4th Gospel author was headed Irrational Rationalism, and there were 2 or 3 more. They were all written vigorously and fearlessly as though by people used to authority. All granted that the Church professed to enjoin belief in much which no one could accept who had been accustomed to weigh evidence, but it was contended that so much valuable truth had got so closely mixed up with these mistakes that the mistakes had better not be meddled with. To lay great stress on these was like cavilling at the Queen's right to reign, on the ground that William the Conqueror was illegitimate. One article maintained that though it would be inconvenient to change the words of our prayer book and articles, it would not be inconvenient to change in a quiet way the meanings which we put upon those words. This, it was argued, was what was actually done in the case of law. This had been the law's mode of growth and adaptation, and had in all ages been found a righteous and convenient method of effecting change. It was suggested that the Church should adopt it. In another essay, it was boldly denied that the Church rested upon reason. It was proved incontestably that its ultimate foundation was, and ought to be, faith, there being indeed no other ultimate foundation than this for any of man's beliefs. If so, the writer claimed that the Church could not be upset by reason. It was founded, like everything else, on initial assumptions, that is to say on faith, and if it was to be upset it was to be upset by faith, by the faith of those who in their lives appeared more graceful, more lovable, better bred in fact, and better able to overcome difficulties. Any sect which showed its superiority in these respects might carry all before it, but none other would make much headway for long together. Christianity was true in so far as it had fostered beauty, and it had fostered much beauty. It was false in so far as it fostered ugliness, and it had fostered much ugliness. It was therefore not a little true and not a little false. On the whole one might go farther and fare worse. The wisest course would be to live with it, and make the best and not the worst of it. The writer urged that we become persecutors, as a matter of course, as soon as we begin to feel very strongly upon any subject. We ought not therefore to do this. We ought not to feel very strongly even upon that institution, which was dearer to the writer than any other Church of England. We should be churchmen, but somewhat lukewarm churchmen, inasmuch as those who care very much about either religion or irreligion are seldom observed to be very well bred or agreeable people. The Church herself should approach as nearly to that of Laodicea as was compatible with her continuing to be a church at all, and each individual member should only be hot in striving to be as lukewarm as possible. The book rang with the courage alike of conviction and of an entire absence of conviction. It appeared to be the work of men who had a rule-of-thumb way of steering between iconoclasm on the one hand and credulity on the other, who cut Gordian knots as a matter of course when it suited their convenience, who shrank from no conclusion in theory, nor from any want of logic in practice so long as they were illogical of malice prepense, and for what they held to be sufficient reason. The conclusions were conservative, quietistic, comforting. The arguments by which they were reached were taken from the most advanced writers of the day. All that these people contended for was granted them, but the fruits of victory were for the most part handed over to those already in possession. Perhaps the passage which attracted most attention in the book was one from the essay on the various marriage systems of the world. It ran, "If people require us to construct," exclaimed the writer, "we set good breeding as the cornerstone of our edifice. We would have it ever present consciously or unconsciously in the minds of all as the central faith, in which they should live and move and have their being, as the touchstone of all things whereby they may be known as good or evil according as they make for good breeding or against it. That a man should have been bred well and breed others well, that his figure, head, hands, feet, voice, manner, and clothes should carry conviction upon this point, so that no one can look at him without seeing that he has come of good stock, and is likely to throw good stock himself, this is the desiderandum, and the same with a woman. The greatest number of these well-bred men and women, and the greatest happiness of these well-bred men and women, this is the highest good. Towards this all government, all social conventions, all art, literature, and science should directly or indirectly tend. Holy men and holy women are those who keep this unconsciously in view at all times, whether of work or pastime. If Ernest had published this work in his own name, I should think it would have fallen stillborn from the press, but the form he had chosen was calculated at that time to arouse curiosity, and as I have said, he had wickedly dropped a few hints which the reviewers did not think anyone would have been impudent enough to do if he were not a bishop, or at any rate someone in authority. A well-known judge was spoken of as being another of the writers, and the idea spread ere long that 6 or 7 of the leading bishops and judges had laid their heads together to produce a volume, which should at once outbid essays and reviews, and counteract the influence of that then still famous work. Reviewers are men of like passions with ourselves, and with them as with everyone else omni ignotum pro magnifico. The book was really an able one and abounded with humour, just satire and good sense. It struck a new note, and the speculation which for some time was rife concerning its authorship made many turn to it who would never have looked at it otherwise. One of the most gushing weeklies had a fit over it, and declared it to be the finest thing that had been done since the Provincial Letters of Pascal. Once a month or so that weekly always found some picture, which was the finest that had been done since the Old Masters, or some satire that was the finest that had appeared since Swift, or some something which was incomparably the finest that had appeared since something else. If Ernest had put his name to the book, and the writer had known that it was by a nobody, he would doubtless have written in a very different strain. Reviewers like to think that for aught they know they are patting a duke or even a prince of the blood upon the back, and lay it on thick till they find they have been only praising Brown, Jones, or Robinson. Then they are disappointed, and as a general rule will pay Brown, Jones, or Robinson out. Ernest was not so much up to the ropes of the literary world as I was, and I am afraid his head was a little turned when he woke up one morning to find himself famous. He was Christina's son, and perhaps would not have been able to do what he had done if he was not capable of occasional undue elation. Ere long, however, he found out all about it, and settled quietly down to write a series of books, in which he insisted on saying things which no one else would say even if they could, or could even if they would. He has got himself a bad literary character. I said to him laughingly one day that he was like the man in the last century of whom it was said that nothing but such a character could keep down such parts. He laughed and said he would rather be like that than like a modern writer or two whom he could name, whose parts were so poor that they could be kept up by nothing but by such a character. I remember soon after one of these books was published, I happened to meet Mrs. Jupp, to whom, by the way, Ernest made a small weekly allowance. It was at Ernest's chambers, and for some reason we were left alone for a few minutes. I said to her, "Mr. Pontifex has written another book, Mrs. Jupp." "Lor, now," said she, "has he really? Dear gentleman, is it about love?" And the old sinner threw up a wicked sheep's eye glance at me from under her aged eyelids. I forget what there was in my reply which provoked it, probably nothing, but she went rattling on at full speed to the effect that Belle had given her a ticket for the opera. So, of course, she said, I went. I didn't understand one word of it, for it was all French, but I saw their legs. Oh dear, I'm afraid I shan't be here much longer, and when dear Mr. Pontifex sees me in my coffin he'll say, poor old Jupp, shall never talk broad any more. But bless you, I am not so old as all that, and I am taking lessons in dancing. At this moment Ernest came in and the conversation was changed. Mrs. Jupp asked if he was still going on writing more books now that this one was done. "Of course I am," he answered. "I am always writing books. Here is the manuscript of my next," and he showed her a heap of paper. "Well now," she exclaimed, dear me, "and is that manuscript? I've often heard talk about manuscripts, but I never thought I should live to see some myself. Well, so that is really manuscript." There were a few geraniums in the window, and they did not look well. Ernest asked Mrs. Jupp if she understood flowers. "I understand the language of flowers," she said, with one of her most bewitching leers, and on this we sent her off till she should choose to honour us with another visit, which she knows she is privileged from time to time to do, for Ernest likes her. Chapter 86, and now I must bring my story to a close. The preceding chapter was written soon after the events it records, that is to say in the spring of 1867. By that time my story had been written up to this point, but it has been altered here and there from time to time occasionally. It is now the autumn of 1882, and if I am to say more I should do so quickly, for I am 80 years old, and though well in health cannot conceal from myself that I am no longer young. Ernest himself is 47, though he hardly looks it. He is richer than ever, for he has never married, and his London and Northwestern shares have nearly doubled themselves. Through sheer inability to spend his income, he has been obliged to hoard in self-defense. He still lives in the Temple in the same rooms I took for him when he gave up his shop, for no one has been able to induce him to take a house. His house, he says, is wherever there is a good hotel. When he is in town he likes to work and to be quiet. When out of town he feels that he has left little behind him that can go wrong, and he would not like to be tied to a single locality. I know no exception, he says, to the rule that it is cheaper to buy milk than to keep a cow. As I have mentioned Mrs. Jupp, I may as well say here the little that remains to be said about her. She is a very old woman now, but no one now living, as she says triumphantly, can say how old, for the woman in the old Kent Road is dead, and presumably has carried her secret to the grave. Old, however, though she is, she lives in the same house, and finds it hard work to make the two ends meet, but I do not know that she minds this very much, and it has prevented her from getting more to drink than would be good for her. It is no use trying to do anything for her beyond paying her allowance weekly, and absolutely refusing to let her anticipate it. She pawns her flat iron every Saturday for 4d, and takes it out every Monday morning for 4d. When she gets her allowance, and has done this for the last 10 years as regularly as the week comes round. As long as she does not let the flat iron actually go, we know that she can still worry out her financial problems in her own hugger-mugger way, and had better be left to do so. If the flat iron were to go beyond redemption, We should know that it was time to interfere. I do not know why, but there is something about her which always reminds me of a woman who was as unlike her as one person can be to another, I mean Ernest's mother. The last time I had a long gossip with her was about 2 years ago when she came to me instead of to Ernest. She said she had seen a cab drive up just as she was going to enter the staircase, and had seen Mr. Pontifex's pa put his Beelzebub old head out of the window, so she had come on to me, for she hadn't greased her sides for no curtsy, not for the likes of him. She professed to be very much down on her luck. Her lodgers did use her so dreadful, going away without paying and leaving not so much as a stick behind, but today she was as pleased as a penny carrot. She had had such a lovely dinner, a cushion of ham and green peas. She had had a good cry over it, but then she was so silly, she was. And there's that bell, she continued, though I could not detect any appearance of connection. It's enough to give anyone the hump to see him now that he's taken to chapel going, and his mother's prepared to meet Jesus and all that to me, and now she ain't a-going too. Die and drinks half a bottle of champagne a day, and then Grig, him as preaches, you know, asked Bell if I really was too gay, not but what when I was young I'd snap my fingers at any fly by night in Holborn, and if I was togged out and had my teeth I'd do it now. I lost my poor dear Watkins, but of course that couldn't be helped, and then I lost my dear Rose. Silly faggot to go and ride on a cart and catch the bronchitics. I never thought when I kissed my dear Rose in Pullen's Passage and she gave me the chop, that I should never see her again, and her gentleman friend was fond of her too, though he was a married man. I dare say she's gone to bits by now. If she could rise and see me with my bad finger, she would cry, and I should say, never mind, ducky, I'm all right. Oh dear, it's coming on to rain. I do hate a wet Saturday night, poor women with their nice white stockings and their living to get, etc., etc. And yet age does not wither this godless old sinner, as people would say it ought to do. Whatever life she has led, it has agreed with her very sufficiently. At times she gives us to understand that she is still much solicited, at others she takes quite a different tone. She has not allowed even Joe King so much as to put his lips to hers this 10 years. She would rather have a mutton chop any day. But you should have seen me when I was sweet 17. I was the very moral of my poor dear mother, and she was a pretty woman, though I say it that shouldn't. She had such a splendid mouth of teeth. It was a sin to bury her in her teeth. I only knew of one thing at which she professes to be shocked. It is that her son Tom and his wife Topsy are teaching the baby to swear. Oh, it's too dreadful awful, she exclaimed. I don't know the meaning of the words, but I tell him he's a drunken sot. I believe the old woman in reality rather likes it. But surely, Mrs. Jupp, said I, Tom's wife used not to be Topsy. You used to speak of her as Phoebe. Ah, yes, she answered, but Phoebe behaved bad and it's Topsy now. Ernest's daughter Alice married the boy who had been her playmate more than a year ago. Ernest gave them all they said they wanted, and a good deal more. They have already presented him with a grandson, and I doubt not, will do so with many more. Georgie, though only 21, is owner of a fine steamer which his father has bought for him. He began when about 13 going with old Rollings and Jack in the barge from Rochester to the upper Thames with bricks. Then his father bought him and Jack barges of their own, and then he bought them both ships and then steamers. I do not exactly know how people make money by having a steamer, but he does whatever is usual, and from all I can gather makes it pay extremely well. He is a good deal like his father in the face, but without a spark so far as I have been able to observe any literary ability. He has a fair sense of humour and abundance of common sense, but his instinct is clearly a practical one. I am not sure that he does not put me in mind almost more of what Theobald would have been if he had been a sailor, than of Ernest. Ernest used to go down to Battersby and stay with his father for a few days twice a year until Theobald's death, and the pair continued on excellent terms, in spite of what the neighbouring clergy call the atrocious books which Mr. Ernest Pontifex has written. Perhaps the harmony, or rather absence of discord which subsisted between the pair, was due to the fact that Theobald had never looked into the inside of one of his son's works, and Ernest, of course, never alluded to them in his father's presence. The pair, as I have said, got on excellently, but it was doubtless as well that Ernest's visits were short and not too frequent. Once Theobald wanted Ernest to bring his children, but Ernest knew they would not like it, so this was not done. Sometimes Theobald came up to town on small business matters, and paid a visit to Ernest's chambers. He generally brought with him a couple of lettuces, or a cabbage, or half a dozen turnips done up in a piece of brown paper, and told Ernest that he knew fresh vegetables were rather hard to get in London, and he had brought him some. Ernest had often explained to him that the vegetables were of no use to him, and that he had rather he would not bring them, but Theobald persisted, I believe through sheer love of doing something which his son did not like, but which was too small to take notice of. He lived until about 12 months ago, when he was found dead in his bed on the morning after having written the following letter to his son. Dear Ernest, I've nothing particular to write about, but your letter has been lying for some days in the limbo of unanswered letters, to wit my pocket, and it's time it was answered. I keep wonderfully well and am able to walk my 5 or 6 miles with comfort, but at my age there's no knowing how long it will last, and time flies quickly. I have been busy potting plants all the morning, but this afternoon is wet. What is this horrid government going to do with Ireland? I don't exactly wish they'd blow up Mr. Gladstone, but if a mad bull would chivy him there, and he would never come back any more, I should not be sorry. Lord Hartington is not exactly the man I should like to set in his place, but he would be immeasurably better than Gladstone. I miss your sister Charlotte more than I can express. She kept my household accounts, and I could pour out to her all little worries, and now that Joey is married too, I don't know what I should do if one or other of them did not come sometimes and take care of me. My only comfort is that Charlotte will make her husband happy, and that he is as nearly worthy of her as a husband can well be. Believe me, your affectionate father, Theobald Pontifex. I may say in passing that though Theobald speaks of Charlotte's marriage as though it were recent, it had really taken place some 6 years previously, she being then about 38 years old, and her husband about 7 years younger. There was no doubt that Theobald passed peacefully away during his sleep. Can a man who died thus be said to have died at all? He has presented the phenomena of death to other people, but in respect of himself he has not only not died, but has not even thought that he was going to die. This is not more than half dying, but then neither was his life more than half living. He presented so many of the phenomena of living that I suppose on the whole it would be less trouble to think of him as having been alive than as never having been born at all, but this is only possible because association does not stick to the strict letter of its bond. This, however, was not the general verdict concerning him, and the general verdict is often the truest. Ernest was overwhelmed with expressions of condolence and respect for his father's memory. He never, said Dr. Martin, the old doctor who brought Ernest into the world, spoke an ill word against anyone. He was not only liked, he was beloved by all who had anything to do with him. A more perfectly just and righteously dealing man, said the family solicitor, I have never had anything to do with nor one more punctual in the discharge of every business obligation. We shall miss him sadly, the bishop wrote to Joey in the very warmest terms. The poor were in consternation. The well's never missed, said one old woman, till it's dry, and she only said what everyone else felt. Ernest knew that the general regret was unaffected, as for a loss which could not be easily repaired. He felt that there were only 3 people in the world who joined insincerely in the tribute of applause, and these were the very 3 who could least show their want of sympathy. I mean Joey, Charlotte, and himself. He felt bitter against himself for being of a mind with either Joey or Charlotte upon any subject, and thankful that he must conceal his being so as far as possible, not because of anything his father had done to him. These grievances were too old to be remembered, no, but because he would never allow him to feel towards him as he was always trying to feel. As long as communication was confined to the merest commonplace, all went well, but if these were departed from ever such a little, he invariably felt that his father's instincts showed themselves in immediate opposition to his own. When he was attacked, his father laid whatever stress was possible on everything which his opponents said. If he met with any check, his father was clearly pleased. What the old doctor had said about Theobald's speaking ill of no man was perfectly true as regards others than himself, but he knew very well that no one had injured his reputation in a quiet way, so far as he dared to do, more than his own father. This is a very common case and a very natural one. It often happens that if the son is right, the father is wrong, and the father is not going to have this if he can help it. It was very hard, however, to say what was the true root of the mischief in the present case. It was not Ernest's having been imprisoned. Theobald forgot all about that much sooner than 9 fathers out of 10 would have done. Partly, no doubt, it was due to incompatibility of temperament, but I believe the main ground of complaint lay in the fact that he had been so independent and so rich while still very young, and that thus the old gentleman had been robbed of his power to tease and scratch in the way which he felt he was entitled to. The love of teasing in a small way when he felt safe in doing so, had remained part of his nature from the days when he told his nurse that he would keep her on purpose to torment her. I suppose it is so with all of us. At any rate, I am sure that most fathers, especially if they are clergymen, are like Theobald. He did not in reality, I am convinced, like Joey or Charlotte one whit better than he liked Ernest. He did not like anyone or anything, or if he liked anyone at all it was his butler, who looked after him when he was not well, and took great care of him and believed him to be the best and ablest man in the whole world. Whether this faithful and attached servant continued to think this after Theobald's will was opened, and it was found what kind of legacy had been left him, I know not. Of his children, the baby who had died at a day old was the only one whom he held to have treated him quite filially. As for Christina, he hardly ever pretended to miss her and never mentioned her name, but this was taken as a proof that he felt her loss too keenly to be able ever to speak of her. It may have been so, but I do not think it. Theobald's effects were sold by auction, and among them the harmony of the Old and New Testaments which he had compiled during many years, with such exquisite neatness, and a huge collection of mis-sermons being, all in fact that he had ever written. These and the harmony fetched 9d. a barrow load. I was surprised to hear that Joey had not given the 3 or 4 shillings which would have bought the whole lot, but Ernest tells me that Joey was far fiercer in his dislike of his father than ever he had been himself, and wished to get rid of everything that reminded him of him. It has already appeared that both Joey and Charlotte are married. Joey has a family, but he and Ernest very rarely have any intercourse. Of course, Ernest took nothing under his father's will. This had long been understood, so that the other two are both well provided for. Charlotte is as clever as ever, and sometimes asks Ernest to come and stay with her and her husband near Dover, I suppose because she knows that the invitation will not be agreeable to him. There is a dehout and bars tone in all her letters. It is rather hard to lay one's finger upon it, but Ernest never gets a letter from her, without feeling that he is being written to by one who has had direct communication with an angel. What an awful creature, he once said to me, that angel must have been if it had anything to do with making Charlotte what she is. Could you like, she wrote to him not long ago, the thoughts of a little sea change here. The top of the cliffs will soon be bright with heather. The gorse must be out already, and the heather I should think begun, to judge by the state of the hill at Ewell, and heather or no heather the cliffs are always beautiful, and if you come your room shall be cosy so that you may have a resting. Corner to yourself. 19 and 6d. is the price of a return ticket which covers a month. Would you decide just as you would yourself like? Only if you come we would hope to try and make it bright for you, but you must not feel it a burden on your mind if you feel disinclined to come in this direction. When I have a bad nightmare, said Ernest to me, laughing as he showed me this letter, I dream that I have got to stay with Charlotte. Her letters are supposed to be unusually well written, and I believe it is said among the family that Charlotte has far more real literary power than Ernest has. Sometimes we think that she is writing at him as much as to say, there no don't you think you are the only one of us who can write. Read this, and if you want a telling bit of descriptive writing for your next book, you can make what use of it you like. I dare say she writes very well, but she has fallen under the dominion of the words hope, think, feel, try, bright and little, and can hardly write a page without introducing all these words and some of them more than once. All this has the effect of making her style monotonous. Ernest is as fond of music as ever, perhaps more so, and of late years has added musical composition to the other irons in his fire. He finds it still a little difficult, and is in constant trouble through getting into the key of C# after beginning in the key of C, and being unable to get back again. Getting into the key of C#, he said, is like an unprotected female travelling on the Metropolitan Railway, and finding herself at Shepherd's Bush without quite knowing where she wants to go to. How is she ever to get safe back to Clapham Junction? And Clapham Junction won't quite do either, for Clapham Junction is like the diminished 7th susceptible of such enharmonic change, that you can resolve it into all the possible termini of music. Talking of music reminds me of a little passage that took place between Ernest and Miss Skinner, Dr. Skinner's eldest daughter, not so very long ago. Dr. Skinner had long left Roughborough, and had become dean of a cathedral in one of our Midland counties, a position which exactly suited him. Finding himself once in the neighbourhood, Ernest called, for old acquaintance' sake, and was hospitably entertained at lunch. 30 years had whitened the doctor's bushy eyebrows's hair they could not whiten. I believe that but for that wig he would have been made a bishop. His voice and manner were unchanged, and when Ernest, remarking upon a plan of Rome which hung in the hall, spoke inadvertently of the Quirinal, he replied with all his wonted pomp, "Yes, the Quirinal, as I myself prefer to call it, the Quirinal." After this triumph he inhaled a long breath through the corners of his mouth, and flung it back again into the face of heaven, as in his finest form during his headmastership. At lunch he did indeed once say, next to impossible to think of anything else, but he immediately corrected himself and substituted the words, next to impossible to entertain irrelevant ideas, after which he seemed to feel a good deal more comfortable. Ernest saw the familiar volumes of Dr. Skinner's works upon the bookshelves in the deanery dining-room, but he saw no copy of Rome or the Bible which. "And are you still as fond of music as ever, Mr. Pontifex?" said Miss Skinner to Ernest during the course of lunch. "Of some kinds of music, yes, Miss Skinner, but you know I never did like modern music." "Isn't that rather dreadful? Don't you think you rather was going to have added ought to?" But she left it unsaid, feeling doubtless that she had sufficiently conveyed her meaning. "I would like modern music if I could. I have been trying all my life to like it, but I succeed less and less the older I grow." "And pray, where do you consider modern music to begin?" "With Sebastian Bach." "And don't you like Beethoven?" "No, I used to think I did when I was younger, but I know now that I never really liked him." "Ah, how can you say so? You cannot understand him. You never could say this if you understood him. For me a simple chord of Beethoven is enough. This is happiness." Ernest was amused at her strong family likeness to her father, a likeness which had grown upon her as she had become older, and which extended even to voice and manner of speaking. He remembered how he had heard me describe the game of chess I had played with the doctor in days gone by, and with his mind's ear seemed to hear Miss Skinner saying, as though it were an epitaph, "Stay, I may presently take a simple chord of Beethoven, or a small semiquaver from one of Mendelssohn's songs without words." After luncheon, when Ernest was left alone for half an hour or so, with the dean, he plied him so well with compliments that the old gentleman was pleased, and flattered beyond his wont. He rose and bowed. "These expressions," he said voce sua, "are very valuable to me." "They are but a small part, sir," rejoined Ernest, "of what any one of your old pupils must feel towards you." And the pair danced as it were a minuet at the end of the dining-room table, in front of the old bay window that looked upon the smooth-shaven lawn. On this Ernest departed, but a few days afterwards the doctor wrote him a letter and told him that his critics were and at the same time. Ernest remembered and knew that the other words were something of like nature, so it was all right. A month or two afterwards, Dr. Skinner was gathered to his father's. "He was an old fool, Ernest," said I, "and you should not relent towards him." "I could not help it," he replied. "He was so old that it was almost like playing with a child." Sometimes, like all whose minds are active, Ernest overworks himself, and then occasionally he has fierce and reproachful encounters with Dr. Skinner or Theobald in his sleep, but beyond this neither of these two worthies can now molest him further. To myself he has been a son and more than a son. At times I am half afraid, as for example when I talk to him about his books, that I may have been to him more like a father than I ought. If I have, I trust he has forgiven me. His books are the only bone of contention between us. I want him to write like other people, and not to offend so many of his readers. He says he can no more change his manner of writing than the colour of his hair, and that he must write as he does or not at all. With the public generally he is not a favourite. He is admitted to have talent, but it is considered generally to be of a queer, unpractical kind, and no matter how serious he is always accused of being in jest. His first book was a success for reasons which I have already explained, but none of his others have been more than creditable failures. He is one of those unfortunate men, each one of whose books is sneered at by literary critics as soon as it comes out, but becomes excellent reading as soon as it has been followed by a later work which may in its turn be condemned. He never asked a reviewer to dinner in his life. I have told him over and over again that this is madness, and find that this is the only thing I can say to him which makes him angry with me. What can it matter to me, he says, whether people read my books or not? It may matter to them, but I have too much money to want more, and if the books have any stuff in them it will work by and by. I do not know nor greatly care whether they are good or not. What opinion can any sane man form about his own work? Some people must write stupid books just as there must be junior ops and third-class pole men. Why should I complain of being among the mediocrities? If a man is not absolutely below mediocrity, let him be thankful. Besides, the books will have to stand by themselves some day, so the sooner they begin the better. I spoke to his publisher about him not long since. Mr. Pontifex, he said, is a homo unius libri, but it doesn't do to tell him so. I could see the publisher, who ought to know, had lost all faith in Ernest's literary position, and looked upon him as a man whose failure was all the more hopeless for the fact of his having once made a coup. He is in a very solitary position, Mr. Overton, continued the publisher. He has formed no alliances, and has made enemies not only of the religious world, but of the literary and scientific brotherhood as well. This will not do nowadays. If a man wishes to get on, he must belong to a set, and Mr. Pontifex belongs to no set, not even to a club. I replied, Mr. Pontifex is the exact likeness of Othello, but with a difference: hates not wisely but too well. He would dislike the literary and scientific swells if he were to come to know them and they him. There is no natural solidarity between him and them, and if he were brought into contact with them, his last state would be worse than his first. His instinct tells him this, so he keeps clear of them, and attacks them whenever he thinks they deserve it, in the hope, perhaps, that a younger generation will listen to him more willingly than the present. Can anything, said the publisher, be conceived more impracticable and imprudent? To all this Ernest replies with one word only: wait. Such is my friend's latest development. He would not, it is true, run much chance at present of trying to found a college of spiritual pathology, but I must leave the reader to determine whether there is not a strong family likeness between the Ernest of the College of Spiritual Pathology and the Ernest who will insist on addressing the next generation rather than his own. He says he trusts that there is not, and takes the sacrament duly once a year as a sop to Nemesis, lest he should again feel strongly upon any subject. It rather fatigues him, but no man's opinions, he sometimes says, can be worth holding unless he knows how to deny them easily and gracefully upon occasion in the cause of charity. In politics, he is a conservative so far as his vote and interest are concerned. In all other respects, he is an advanced radical. His father and grandfather could probably no more understand his state of mind than they could understand Chinese, but those who know him intimately do not know that they wish him greatly different from what he actually is.